Welcome to History Teller YT, where we bring the past to life one chapter at a time. Today, you're about to dive into one of the most powerful, complex, and emotional journeys in human history. This is the full story of World War I, told from the spark that ignited it in Sarajevo to the collapse of empires, the reshaping of nations, and the birth of the modern world. In this series, you'll hear about political rivalries, secret alliances, military strategies, technological breakthroughs, and the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians whose world changed forever. You'll witness how a single assassination spiraled into a global conflict. You'll follow the rise and fall of powerful empires, the harsh reality of trench warfare, and the moment when the world finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918. This introduction is just a glimpse. The full story brings together emotion, strategy, human struggle, victory, tragedy, and everything in between. By the end, you won't just understand how World War I unfolded. You'll feel why it mattered, how it changed everything, and why its echoes still shape our lives today. If you're ready, let's step back into 1914 and begin the journey. By the early 20th century, Europe looked peaceful on the surface, but the calm hid a long list of quarrels, rivalries, and nervous governments bracing for the next crisis. Monarchs still held power across much of the continent, but their influence was being challenged by social movements, powerful political parties, and restless populations who wanted a stronger national identity. Nations were building industrial strength at breakneck speed, and with that came vast armies, factories producing modern weapons, and a generation of young men trained to think of war as a test of national pride. None of this erupted overnight. It simmered for decades as each country built its own worldview and strategic goals, almost always shaped by competition with neighbors. Germany wanted recognition as a major world power after unifying in 1871. France still felt deeply wounded by the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany and hoped one day to reclaim it. Russia saw itself as protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans, especially Serbia, and pushed for influence in the region. Austria-Hungary feared the opposite trend, worried that rising nationalism among Slavs would tear its empire apart. Britain, although geographically removed from continental politics, focused on protecting its global empire and maintaining a balance of power in Europe. Under these conditions, diplomacy turned into a game of suspicion. Every military expansion or political agreement triggered a counterreaction. If Germany built a stronger navy, Britain strengthened its own. If Russia moved troops near its borders, Austria-Hungary adjusted its military plans. This constant checking and rechecking created a climate where leaders expected conflict at some point and strategists believed the first country to strike would have the advantage. Meanwhile, newspapers across Europe fed the public steady doses of patriotic emotion, portraying rivals as threats to national honor. The atmosphere was tense, but oddly normal, as if everyone accepted that war was a natural part of how nations resolve disputes. The combination of pride, fear, and ambition made Europe a powder keg waiting for a spark. And as 1914 approached, the smallest diplomatic crisis could trigger something far greater than any politician imagined. The alliances that shaped Europe before the First World War were meant to deter conflict. But in reality, they created a situation where any local dispute risked pulling half the continent into a fight. Germany and Austria-Hungary formed a close partnership known as the Dual Alliance, later expanded to include Italy as the Triple Alliance. This group believed their security depended on presenting a united political and military front. On the other side, France and Russia formed their own alliance in the 1890s, driven mainly by their shared distrust of Germany. Britain initially avoided long-term commitments, But shifting global politics pushed it closer to France, leading to the Entente Cordiale, and eventually Britain, France, and Russia formed what became known as the Triple Entente. These alliances were not just friendly agreements. They contained military planning, expectations for troop movements, and assumptions about how quickly each country would act if a crisis occurred. Governments spent years drafting war plans based on these alignments, believing any potential opponent would mobilize the instant a threat appeared. Once one nation chose to mobilize, its neighbors felt compelled to do the same, creating a chain reaction that could spin out of control. The alliances also made political leaders bolder. Small nations like Serbia knew they had larger allies behind them. Larger nations felt confident they could pressure rivals without standing alone. Diplomats often misread signals or underestimated how seriously the other side would react. What made this particularly dangerous was the sense that European war planning was rigid. Military timetables were seen as sacred documents, and leaders feared that delaying mobilization by even a day might cost them victory in a future conflict. As a result, what should have been a collection of treaties meant to maintain peace instead created a trap. The actions of one small group or a single decision by a regional power could activate the alliance networks and bring multiple empires onto the battlefield. This tightening web meant that by 1914, no country could handle a crisis on its own terms. Everything was connected. Every move had consequences far beyond its borders. When the assassination in Sarajevo occurred, these alliances ensured the event would not remain a local tragedy. It guaranteed that the world would soon face a war larger than anything it had ever seen. The Balkans were often described as the most unstable region in Europe in the years before 1914. It was a place where empires collided, ethnic groups struggled for independence, and political violence was a regular feature of life. Serbia had risen rapidly in the early 20th century, driven by a strong national identity and the dream of leading a unified Slavic state. Austria-Hungary saw Serbia's ambition as an existential threat. A significant portion of Austria-Hungary's population was Slavic, and leaders in Vienna worried that Serbian nationalism might inspire these groups to rebel or seek independence. Russia, portraying itself as the protector of Slavs, supported Serbia's aspirations and competed with Austria-Hungary for influence in the region. All these pressures turned the Balkans into a battlefield of ideas, alliances, and secret plots. Two Balkan wars erupted in 1912 and 1913. These conflicts rearranged borders, destabilized old powers, and fed Serbian confidence that it could challenge Austria-Hungary. At the same time, nationalist secret societies gained influence. Some operated openly as cultural groups, while others worked underground, training militants and planning attacks against imperial officials. One such group, often connected to circles inside Serbia's military intelligence, viewed Austria-Hungary as an occupying force and believed violence was a legitimate path toward liberation. In this environment, the arrival of an Austrian heir to the throne in the city of Sarajevo felt provocative to many local nationalists. Franz Ferdinand had intended his visit to show goodwill, but instead it was seen as a symbol of imperial control. The intersection of these forces created a setting where assassination was not unthinkable. There was frustration, humiliation, and anger among groups who believed their national identity had been suppressed for generations. Austria-Hungary responded to rising nationalism with strict policies, which only deepened resentment. For many young radicals in the region, political assassination seemed heroic, a way to deliver a decisive blow against empire. This sense of righteous rebellion mixed with the strategic interests of powerful nations to produce a volatile situation. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand stepped into Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, he entered a region charged with tension. No one realized it at the time, but all the conditions for a global crisis were already in place. The assassination would not create the hostility. It would simply release what had been building for decades. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not a simple man, nor was he particularly beloved within the vast and complicated empire he was meant to inherit. Born in 1863, he grew up in a royal environment shaped by military discipline, ceremonial duties, and a strict sense of hierarchy. Yet under that polished exterior, he had strong personal opinions about the empire's future. He believed Austria-Hungary needed major reforms if it wanted to survive the modern age. The empire contained dozens of ethnic groups, each with its own language, tradition, and political demands. Franz Ferdinand understood that suppressing these voices would only increase unrest. His hope was to strengthen the monarchy by granting greater autonomy to the various nationalities within the empire, creating a kind of federal structure where different groups could manage their own affairs while still remaining loyal to the Habsburg crown. This plan worried many hardliners in Vienna, who feared any concessions would weaken the empire. It also worried Serbian nationalists, who suspected that a reformed and more inclusive Austria-Hungary might reduce their chances of expanding influence over the Slavic populations inside the empire. In his personal life, Franz Ferdinand made choices that further complicated his political position. His marriage to Sophie Chotek, a woman of noble background but not of ruling dynasty status, caused scandal at the imperial court. The emperor eventually allowed the marriage, but only under the condition that Sophie would never be named queen and their children would not inherit the throne. This created a sense of bitterness around Franz Ferdinand, as if he were constantly being reminded that he was both essential to the empire's future and yet somehow kept at arm's length by the imperial establishment. Despite these tensions, he took his responsibilities seriously. His military career was long and well documented, and he often toured various regions of the empire to learn firsthand how people lived and what issues troubled them. His 1914 visit to Bosnia, however, placed him in a region where nationalist anger was unusually intense. Although he intended to demonstrate goodwill and show attention to the needs of the province, many in the local population viewed him instead as a representative of imperial control. The fact that he arrived on a date that carried heavy symbolic meaning for Serbs made the visit even more controversial. By the time his motorcade entered Sarajevo, the atmosphere was tense enough that even a small provocation could have triggered public disorder. Few, however, predicted the level of violence that was about to unfold. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not an impulsive act carried out by a lone gunman. It grew from years of political frustration, underground organizing, and a spread of radical ideas among young nationalist groups in the Balkans. At the center of this environment was an organization widely known as the Black Hand. It was not the official name, but it captured the group's reputation for secrecy and violent methods. Many of its members came from the Serbian military or from circles connected to intelligence networks. Their motivation was the dream of a unified Slavic state led by Serbia, a dream they believed could only be achieved by weakening Austria-Hungary's control over the region. Although the Serbian government did not openly endorse acts of terrorism, certain individuals within the government and military were sympathetic to the group. This created a complex situation where radicals felt encouraged, even if there was no formal approval from official institutions. Alongside the Black Hand was a youth-oriented movement known as Young Bosnia. This group attracted idealistic students, writers, and activists who believed their generation had a responsibility to act where older generations had failed. They saw the empire as oppressive and outdated, and they believed violence could spark a political awakening. Their worldview was shaped by romantic nationalism, social revolution theories, and anger over economic inequality. Although some members dreamed of cultural renewal rather than bloodshed, the overall climate in the region pushed even moderate voices toward accepting the idea that assassination might be justified. The individuals recruited for the plot in Sarajevo were young, still teenagers or barely adults. They were shaped by a mix of personal frustration, political stories about national pride, and a belief that sacrifice for one's people was the highest form of duty. The decision to target Franz Ferdinand came after his planned visit became public knowledge. To the radicals, the heir to the throne represented everything they wanted to resist. They believed that killing him would weaken Austria-Hungary and inspire Slavic groups across the empire to rise up. The operation itself was planned with a level of seriousness unusual for such inexperienced youths. Bombs and pistols were supplied. Routes were studied. Positions along the motorcade path were assigned. Yet for all their preparations, the conspirators were nervous and poorly trained. Some were sick. Some doubted whether they could actually pull the trigger when the moment arrived. Still, the plan moved forward because they felt history demanded action. They believed a single act could shake the foundations of an empire. What they did not understand was that their actions would soon shake the entire world. The trip to Sarajevo was part of a larger military inspection tour. Local authorities wanted to demonstrate that Bosnia, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, was stable and loyal to the empire. In reality, the region was full of political tension. Reports warning of possible violence were circulated, but they did not trigger serious alarm among the decision-makers. This was partly because Franz Ferdinand was not widely hated among the general public. Many officials also assumed that nationalist groups in the area lacked the organization or courage to attack a member of the imperial family. As a result, security planning for the visit was casual at best. The motorcade route was publicly announced, complete with precise times. Officials ignored suggestions to modify the schedule or strengthen the security perimeter. Police presence was increased, but not to the level necessary for protecting a high-profile figure in a hostile environment. Franz Ferdinand himself insisted on maintaining a visible and open presence. He did not want the visit to appear overly guarded or militaristic. He believed that showing trust in the people of Sarajevo would promote better relations. His wife Sophie accompanied him, partly because the date had personal meaning for their marriage, and partly because she enjoyed public events where she was treated more warmly than she was at the imperial court. Their appearance together added a sense of ceremony to the visit, and local officials tried to present a festive atmosphere. Flags were displayed. Speeches were prepared. Crowds gathered, many out of curiosity and others out of genuine interest. But beneath the celebration, danger was quietly gathering along the route. The conspirators were already in position. Some stood nervously in the crowd, bombs hidden under their coats. Others clutched pistols with sweaty hands, silently repeating their instructions. They did not know whether the plan would succeed. They only knew that the opportunity would not come again. As the Archduke's car moved closer, the fate of empires balanced on a few young men who had never imagined that their actions might set off a chain reaction involving nearly every major power in Europe. The visit was meant to display unity. Instead, it would reveal all the fractures beneath the surface and send the world into its deadliest conflict up to that time. June 28th, 1914 began like any other summer morning in Sarajevo, but beneath the surface the day carried emotional weight. For Serbs, it was the anniversary of Kosovo, a historic moment tied to cultural identity, sacrifice, and national pride. The symbolism of the Archduke choosing that date for his visit created a charged atmosphere. Streets were decorated, but the crowds that gathered expressed mixed emotions. Some were simply curious, while others viewed the procession with suspicion. The city's narrow streets and uneven riverbanks created a setting where security was difficult to manage, yet officials remained confident. As the motorcade assembled, Franz, Ferdinand, and Sophie were in good spirits. They spoke casually with their attendants and showed appreciation for the local reception. Their intention was to complete the day's events smoothly, then return to Vienna, where political responsibilities awaited them. Meanwhile, the group of conspirators began to take their positions along the well-publicized route. Each young radical carried a sense of mission that overpowered personal fear. They had been trained, but none of them had ever faced a moment of real violence. Some were pale, restless, or visibly trembling as they waited for the cars to appear. The plan relied on a series of overlapping attempts. If one failed, another would act. The pressure on each individual was immense. The responsibility of changing history rested on teenagers and young adults who had barely stepped into adulthood. As the motorcade moved past the first conspirator, nothing happened. He froze, overwhelmed by the sight of the Archduke only a few steps away. A second conspirator also hesitated, doubting whether he could throw his bomb in front of so many onlookers. For a moment, it seemed possible the plot would collapse under its own weight, and that the Archduke would complete his visit without incident. The illusion broke when Nedeljko Kabranovic found his courage. He hurled a bomb toward the Archduke's car, but the device bounced off the folded roof and exploded under the next vehicle, injuring members of the entourage and several bystanders. Panic rippled through the crowd. Soldiers and police swarmed the area. Kabranovic swallowed cyanide in an attempt to take his own life, but the poison was weak and he survived long enough to be captured. The Archduke's driver accelerated and the motorcade rushed onward. Although Franz Ferdinand was shaken, he insisted on continuing the official program. Many believed the worst had passed, but the failed attack created an environment of confusion that would unintentionally open the door to a far deadlier second attempt. The conspirators who had hesitated earlier now believed their chance was gone. Only one of them, standing quietly and trying to decide whether the day was over, would soon find himself face to face with destiny. After the bomb attack, officials urged Franz Ferdinand to cancel the remaining events for his safety. He refused, feeling a sense of duty to the injured and a desire not to appear intimidated. The revised plan included visiting the wounded from the explosion at the local hospital. This decision, made under pressure and without careful planning, set in motion a series of mistakes. The mayor and other dignitaries attempted to carry on with speeches, but the Archduke interrupted sharply, pointing out the absurdity of continuing a celebratory program after an assassination attempt. Tension filled the air. The officials scrambled to adjust schedules and routes while also managing the chaos spreading through the city. Communication between the escorts broke down. Some officers believed the motorcade would take the original path. Others believed a new, safer route had been approved. In the rush and confusion, the drivers received mixed instructions. As the cars moved out again, the lead vehicle made a wrong turn onto a street that had not been cleared. It slowed when the error was noticed. The driver attempted to reverse, creating an unexpected pause in the heart of the city. This quiet moment changed the course of world history. Standing only a few feet away was Gavrilo Princip, a young conspirator who believed his mission had failed earlier that morning. He had wandered to get food, exhausted and disappointed. When he saw the Archduke's car stop right in front of him, he recognized the extraordinary chance he had been given. Everything that had gone wrong for the conspirators suddenly fell into place. Princip stepped toward the open car. The Archduke and Sophie were seated side by side. Without hesitation, he raised his pistol and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck Sophie, who collapsed almost immediately. The other struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Witnesses later remembered Sophie's attempt to protect her husband and the Archduke's repeated plea for her to stay alive. Soldiers wrestled Princip to the ground, but the damage was done. Within minutes, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dying in the car as it hurried back toward the governor's residence. The speed of the assassination stunned those who witnessed it. It was brutal, direct, and tragically efficient. Officials tried to administer aid, but Sophie died first. Franz Ferdinand followed shortly, still speaking her name. Word of the killings spread rapidly, but at the time few understood that those gunshots would pull entire nations into a colossal war. For the moment, Sarajevo was simply a city in shock, struggling to understand what had just happened. The immediate aftermath of the assassination unfolded with speed, confusion, and an intensity that swept through Sarajevo's streets. Crowds scattered after the shots were fired, then regrouped as rumors grew louder. Police stations filled with people reporting what they had seen. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Some residents expressed anger at the attack, fearing that Austria-Hungary would retaliate harshly. Others, influenced by nationalist fervor, viewed Princip as a hero even before the full details were known. The official response was swift. Streets were closed, soldiers poured into key locations, and local authorities attempted to contain any unrest. Princip was taken into custody, bruised but alive, and Kabranovic had already been detained. The remaining conspirators were rounded up within days. While the city struggled to regain order, Vienna received the devastating news. The imperial government reacted with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. Franz Ferdinand had not been a universally admired figure among the elite, but he was still the heir to the throne and a symbol of continuity in a fragile empire. His death felt like a direct challenge to Austria-Hungary's authority. Many officials immediately blamed Serbia, regardless of whether the Serbian government had actually ordered the attack. The assassination seemed like proof that Serbian nationalism posed a threat not just to Bosnia, but to the entire empire. Vienna's leaders believed that failing to respond forcefully would encourage further rebellion. As the news spread across Europe, governments watched carefully. Diplomats recognized the potential for crisis, but hoped that firm words and limited action might prevent escalation. Few realized that Austria-Hungary's internal politics and its alliance with Germany would push events toward confrontation rather than negotiation. For the people of the empire, the assassination created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Some feared immediate war. Others believed the empire would punish only the conspirators. Across different ethnic groups, the event triggered widely different emotions. In some cities, anti-Serb riots broke out, fueled by anger and propaganda. Businesses were looted and families fled for safety. Tensions that had simmered for years suddenly burst into open hostility. The assassination did not create these divisions, but it exposed them in a way that could no longer be ignored. The shock that began on a street corner in Sarajevo now spread through the capitals of Europe. Within a month, a chain of diplomatic and military decisions would carry the continent into a catastrophic war. The shots fired by Princip were small in number, but enormous in consequence. They broke the delicate balance that had held Europe together and opened a path to a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. When news of the assassination reached Vienna, reactions inside the imperial court were layered with grief, frustration, and political calculation. The death of Franz Ferdinand was tragic for the royal family. But it also created a vacuum in a government already divided by competing factions. Some officials had never liked the Archduke's reform ideas and considered him stubborn, but they recognized that his assassination was more than a personal loss. It was an attack on the integrity of the empire. Emperor Franz Joseph expressed sorrow, though his relationship with Franz Ferdinand had long been strained. Behind closed doors, however, military leaders and conservative politicians began shaping a narrative that aimed to place full responsibility on Serbia. They believed the assassination was not merely the act of a small extremist group, but a sign that Serbia was becoming dangerously bold. To them, failing to act decisively would signal weakness and could encourage more nationalist uprisings. Within the empire's political circles, discussions turned intense. Some argued for immediate military action. Others urged caution, encouraging diplomatic pressure rather than force. The foreign minister, Berchtold, was particularly eager to use the event to confront Serbia. He saw an opportunity to settle long-standing disputes and assert the empire's authority. High-ranking members of the military supported him, believing the army needed a moment of demonstration to restore respect in the region. Civilian officials, on the other hand, worried that a reckless response could trigger a broader conflict given the alliance systems already in place. The assassination acted as a spotlight, revealing how divided the empire truly was. Ideological disagreements, unresolved reforms, and tensions among national groups all became part of the debate. The empire looked unified in mourning, but internally it was full of competing voices, each offering different strategies for how to respond to Serbia. While officials argued, the population faced the emotional fallout. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of the assassination, often exaggerating details to fuel outrage. Public opinion began to turn sharply against Serbia, even though most people had only a vague understanding of Serbian politics. Anti-Serb riots erupted in some cities, encouraged by political figures who wanted to steer public anger toward a single external enemy. The atmosphere became charged with calls for justice and revenge. Very few questioned whether the empire's response might lead to a larger crisis. The empire had been weakening for years, and many elites believed this was a moment to reassert strength. The political storm gathering in Vienna would soon reach beyond its borders, drawing Europe into a diplomatic struggle that edged closer to war with every passing day. The assassination set off a wave of alarm throughout European capitals. Governments understood that the Balkans were a pressure point, and any violent incident there carried the risk of destabilizing the entire continent. In Berlin, London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, diplomats began gathering information, trying to understand whether the attack represented isolated nationalist violence or a sign that Austria-Hungary planned to confront Serbia. None of the major powers wanted a European war, at least not as their first instinct. They worried that the conflict might spread beyond the Balkans, triggering mobilization plans that had been designed with little flexibility. The alliance system had created a world where one government's decisions could rapidly force others to react. As reports from Vienna grew more intense, leaders realized they were facing a critical moment that demanded careful calculation. Germany was the first major power to respond strongly to Austria-Hungary's anger. Kaiser Wilhelm II expressed personal sympathy and supported the idea of taking firm action against Serbia. German military leaders believed a decisive confrontation might restore stability in the Balkans. More importantly, Germany felt compelled to back its ally to avoid weakening the strategic partnership that anchored its position in Europe. At the same time, the German government underestimated how Russia would react. Russian leaders viewed Serbia as part of their sphere of cultural and political influence, and they believed that allowing Austria-Hungary to crush Serbia would diminish Russia's role in the region. This belief would turn out to be one of the most critical miscalculations of the entire crisis. In France, officials followed developments closely, aware that their alliance with Russia might pull them into any escalating conflict. France did not want a major war, especially given the long shadow of the Franco-Prussian War, but it also could not abandon Russia. Britain found itself in a difficult position as well. It was part of the Triple Entente, but it had no obligation to enter a war automatically. British leaders hoped diplomacy would calm tensions before the situation spiraled beyond control. They recognized, however, that once Austria-Hungary took aggressive steps, other nations would be forced into difficult choices. Europe stood watching Vienna, each government aware that one decision could tip the balance toward peace or catastrophe. This fragile moment defined the days leading up to the ultimatum that Austria-Hungary was preparing for Serbia. While Austria-Hungary prepared its response, the Serbian government found itself operating in a climate of fear and uncertainty. Officials in Belgrade knew immediately that they were in danger. They understood that Austria-Hungary had been waiting for a reason to restrain Serbia's growing influence. Although the Serbian government did not order the assassination, it could not deny that nationalist groups inside its borders have been growing bolder. Some members of Serbia's military intelligence had connections to the conspirators, but the government lacked full control over these factions. This created a dangerous situation where Austria-Hungary could easily argue that Serbia was responsible for fostering an environment that encouraged political violence. The Serbian Prime Minister, Nikola Pašic, recognized how serious the threat was. He feared that Austria-Hungary would not accept explanations or concessions and would instead use the assassination as justification for military action. Serbia's army was capable but exhausted from the recent Balkan wars and not prepared to face a great empire. Pašic attempted to distance the government from extremist groups, but the effort came late and carried little weight in Vienna. Diplomats urged calm, encouraging Serbia to cooperate with any investigation Austria-Hungary proposed. Meanwhile, Serbian politicians worried that the public would react emotionally, making diplomatic efforts even harder. National pride was strong in Serbia. Many viewed Austria-Hungary as oppressive and believed standing firm was essential for national honor. This attitude complicated attempts to manage the crisis peacefully. Across the country, citizens waited anxiously for news. Rumors spread quickly, and many feared an invasion. Soldiers were quietly placed on alert, though mobilization was avoided to prevent provoking Vienna. Serbia's leaders understood that once Austria-Hungary made its demands, there would be little room to maneuver. They hoped for support from Russia, but also feared that relying too heavily on a powerful ally could accidentally trigger a larger conflict. Every option available to Serbia carried enormous risk. The political atmosphere grew tense, and the assassination, which had originally been intended to strike at Austria-Hungary, now threatened the very survival of Serbia itself. The country stood on the edge of a crisis, waiting for the moment when Austria-Hungary would present its ultimatum, a document that would determine whether Europe moved toward negotiation or stepped into a war that would reshape the world. In the weeks following the assassination, Vienna became a center of intense political pressure. Ministers, generals, and diplomats held long meetings behind closed doors, trying to determine the best way to respond to the crisis. Although public discussions focused on justice for Franz Ferdinand, private debates centered on the future of the empire itself. Austria-Hungary had struggled with ethnic tensions for decades, and many leaders felt that showing weakness would accelerate the empire's decline. They argued that Serbia needed to be punished not simply because of the assassination, but to prevent future nationalist movements from gaining momentum. Others urged a more cautious approach, warning that any extreme action could trigger intervention from Russia. These voices, however, grew quieter as the more aggressive faction gained influence. A key factor was the involvement of Germany. Austria-Hungary's leaders reached out to Berlin soon after the assassination, hoping for reassurance that Germany would stand by them. The German government responded with what later became known as the blank check, essentially promising full support regardless of what action Austria-Hungary chose to take. This backing strengthened the position of those who favored a harsh response. They believed that with Germany's military power behind them, they could neutralize Serbia quickly before Russia had time to intervene. The confidence produced by Berlin's support made it easier for Vienna to ignore more measured recommendations. A diplomatic investigation or negotiations seemed too slow and too uncertain. Instead, many officials believed the empire needed a dramatic, decisive move that would reassert control over the Balkans. Despite this bold posture, there were still concerns in Vienna. Some diplomats worried that a strong ultimatum might force Serbia into rejection, setting off a chain reaction that Europe would be unable to stop. There were also lingering doubts about whether Austria-Hungary had the military strength to carry out a major campaign, as the empire had been steadily weakening. These doubts were overshadowed by a deep desire among leaders to restore their empire's prestige. The situation created a political climate where restraint felt like surrender. In the end, Vienna moved toward a plan that would combine diplomatic language with demands so intrusive that Serbia could not possibly accept them fully. The goal was to provoke Serbia into refusal while still appearing to the world as though Austria-Hungary sought justice rather than conquest. With this strategy taking shape, the government began drafting an ultimatum unlike any Europe had seen in decades. The ultimatum sent to Serbia on July 23, 1914, was not just a diplomatic note. It was a carefully crafted document designed to provoke a crisis while allowing Austria-Hungary to claim it had taken a reasonable step. The drafting process involved intense discussions among senior officials. Each demand was shaped to appear legitimate on the surface while undermining Serbia's sovereignty. The authors wanted to present the ultimatum as a response to terrorism, but the true purpose was to weaken Serbia politically and militarily. The language was intentionally strict, leaving little space for negotiation. Vienna believed that only a firm approach would prevent future nationalist movements and demonstrate the empire's determination. The ultimatum contained 10 demands. Some were harsh, but not impossible. Serbia was required to suppress anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolve nationalist organizations, and arrest individuals connected to the assassination plot. Other demands, however, went far beyond typical diplomatic expectations. Austria-Hungary insisted that Austrian officials be allowed to participate directly in investigations inside Serbia. This requirement struck at the heart of Serbian independence. It meant that foreign officials would gain authority on Serbian soil, something no sovereign state could accept without losing dignity and autonomy. Another demand required Serbia to dismiss certain military officers whom Austria-Hungary believed to be connected to extremist groups. Vienna's leaders knew that removing these individuals would undermine Serbia's internal stability and military command. The ultimatum gave Serbia only 48 hours to respond, a time frame intentionally chosen to increase pressure. Vienna knew that Serbia needed Russian support and hoped the short deadline would prevent Russia from offering a detailed plan or an immediate military commitment. Austria-Hungary wanted swift, irreversible action. The purpose was not negotiation, but provocation. Diplomats in Vienna believed that Serbia would reject at least one of the central demands, allowing Austria-Hungary to claim it had been patient and reasonable. This would justify military action in the eyes of Europe. The document became one of the most consequential pieces of diplomacy in modern history. Its wording guaranteed that Serbia would face an impossible choice: accept humiliation or risk war with a much larger empire. As Austria-Hungary prepared to deliver the ultimatum, leaders felt confident they had crafted the perfect mechanism to restore authority in the Balkans, unaware that they were stepping into a chain reaction that would engulf the entire continent. When the ultimatum arrived in Belgrade, Serbian leaders knew instantly that they were facing one of the gravest moments in their nation's history. The document's severity shocked even those who had anticipated a strong response from Vienna. It was clear that Austria-Hungary was not looking for cooperation, but for submission. Prime Minister Pašić and his cabinet studied each demand carefully, recognizing that compliance would leave Serbia deeply compromised. They wanted to avoid war, but accepting foreign control over their internal affairs was unthinkable. At the same time, outright rejection of the ultimatum meant certain conflict, and Serbia was exhausted from recent wars. The army needed recovery, and the economy could not sustain a prolonged fight. Pašić immediately reached out to Russia, seeking guidance. Russian officials urged Serbia to remain calm while promising support if Austria-Hungary attacked. Still, Russia asked Serbia to respond as moderately as possible to avoid giving Vienna a clear pretext for war. This created a delicate balancing act for the Serbian government. They needed to show willingness to cooperate while preserving national integrity. Over the next 48 hours, the Serbian cabinet worked tirelessly, drafting a response that accepted many points but carefully reworded others. Serbia agreed to arrest individuals connected to the plot, suppress extremist groups, and limit propaganda. However, they could not accept demands that allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to operate freely within Serbia. To soften the refusal, the response offered to submit disputed points to international arbitration. Meanwhile, citizens in Belgrade anxiously awaited news. Some prepared to flee, fearing bombardment. Others gathered in the streets, driven by a mix of anger and patriotism. The Serbian army was placed on a limited alert, though mobilization was not fully declared in order to avoid provoking Vienna. When the final response was delivered, it was more conciliatory than anyone expected. Yet Austria-Hungary had never intended to negotiate. The partial rejection was all Vienna needed to declare Serbia's reply inadequate. Within hours, diplomats recognized that the ultimatum had accomplished its real purpose. Serbia had tried to avoid conflict, but war was now almost inevitable. This moment was the turning point where diplomacy unraveled, and Europe began sliding toward the catastrophe that would become the First World War. When Austria-Hungary received Serbia's reply to the ultimatum on July 25th, officials in Vienna barely glanced at the conciliatory tone. They had already decided that nothing short of total acceptance would satisfy them. Serbia's willingness to negotiate, revise internal policies, and cooperate with international arbitration did not matter. The partial refusal of a few key demands was enough. Vienna wanted a casus belli, and the ultimatum had provided exactly that. Within hours, diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed. Serbia's ambassador was dismissed, and soldiers in the empire were quietly placed on alert. Newspapers announced that Serbia had insulted the monarchy by refusing justice. Public anger grew, reinforced by a flood of patriotic rhetoric. Many Austrians felt that the empire was finally taking a stand after years of frustration. The emotional reaction made it easier for Vienna to justify the next steps. Behind closed doors, military leaders argued that war must begin quickly before Serbia could fully mobilize or Russia could intervene. They believed that a swift victory would stabilize the Balkans and reassert Austria-Hungary's dominance. Yet the empire faced internal challenges. Its army was large, but stretched across a patchwork of diverse ethnic regions. Communication was slow, and mobilization required careful coordination. Even so, leadership pressed forward with determination. The government announced a partial mobilization aimed at Serbia alone. This step was significant because it signaled to Europe that Austria-Hungary was entering a phase where negotiation was no longer relevant. Diplomatic voices calling for calm were overshadowed by those demanding action. To many in Vienna, the conflict seemed like a controlled regional affair, something that could be resolved before larger powers reacted. They did not fully appreciate how quickly events could spiral. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The declaration was met with mixed emotions throughout the empire. Some citizens cheered, believing this would be a short conflict that would restore imperial pride. Others feared the consequences, aware that Serbia's alliances might draw in other nations. The bombardment of Belgrade began the same evening, as artillery shells thundered across the river from positions inside Austria-Hungary. The sight shocked the world. A local political conflict had crossed into open warfare. European governments understood immediately that these first shots could lead to a far larger catastrophe. Yet they also hoped that if they moved carefully, diplomatic pressure might contain the conflict. Unfortunately, the alliances and military plans already in place were like gears in a machine that had begun turning. Once they moved, stopping them became nearly impossible. Russia faced one of the most complex decisions in its modern history. The assassination and subsequent ultimatum threatened its influence in the Balkans, particularly over Serbia, a nation Russia viewed not just as an ally, but as a symbolic protectorate of Slavic identity. When Austria-Hungary declared war, Russian leaders realized they had to act or risk losing credibility across the region. Yet Russia was not prepared for a major war. Its military was large but poorly organized, stretched across vast territories, and short on modern equipment. Mobilization would require time that Russia feared it did not have. At the same time, doing nothing would damage Russia's prestige and weaken its position in Europe. The government faced enormous pressure from nationalist groups that demanded intervention. Intellectuals, military officers, and political leaders argued that Russia had a duty to defend Serbia regardless of the cost. Tsar Nicholas II, often indecisive in crises, found himself torn between personal reluctance and political necessity. He exchanged messages with Kaiser Wilhelm II, hoping their personal rapport might ease tensions. These telegrams, sometimes called the Willy-Nicky correspondence, showed two rulers desperately trying to prevent war while simultaneously defending their nation's interests. Both leaders expressed reluctance, but each insisted the other take the first step toward de-escalation. Wilhelm asked Russia not to mobilize. Nicholas asked Germany to pressure Austria-Hungary into halting its attack on Serbia. Neither request aligned with the military expectations of their governments. Behind them stood generals and ministers who believed that delay meant disaster. Eventually, Russia announced a partial mobilization aimed only at Austria-Hungary. This decision was meant to signal seriousness without provoking Germany. But Russian military planners quickly argued that partial mobilization was impractical. The mobilization system was so interconnected that it was nearly impossible to prepare only one portion of the army without affecting the rest. As pressure mounted, Russia shifted to full mobilization on July 30th. This decision shocked Germany. To Berlin, Russian mobilization meant that Germany would soon face a two-front war. Diplomats scrambled to resolve the situation, but trust was breaking down rapidly. Mobilization orders created a sense of inevitability. Generals argued that once mobilization began, stopping it would leave the nation vulnerable. The dominoes were now falling. Russia had taken a step that made a larger war more likely, even if the Tsar still hoped conflict could be avoided. Germany watched the unfolding crisis with a mixture of alarm and determination. Its alliance with Austria-Hungary meant it could not remain neutral if Russia intervened. Yet German leaders hoped that the show of force against Serbia would be enough to deter Russian action. When Russia began mobilizing, the German government faced a painful choice. Either pressure Austria-Hungary to compromise or prepare to fight a two-front war against both Russia and France. German military planning, especially the famous Schlieffen Plan, assumed that war with Russia would automatically involve France. The plan required Germany to strike France first, move through Belgium, and win a quick victory before turning east to face Russia's slower mobilization. This strategy created a rigid structure. Once Russia mobilized, Germany believed it must act immediately to avoid being caught unprepared. In Berlin, the debates were intense. The Kaiser initially hoped diplomacy could still succeed. He even considered proposals that might allow Austria-Hungary and Serbia to negotiate with international oversight. But German generals argued that any delay would be disastrous. To them, Russian mobilization was the point of no return. Germany sent an ultimatum demanding that Russia halt its mobilization. At the same time, it sent another ultimatum to France, asking for neutrality in the event of a German-Russian war. Both ultimatums were doomed. Russia refused to reverse its mobilization, and France could not abandon its alliance with Russia. Governments across Europe realized the crisis had reached a stage where military logic overpowered diplomatic reasoning. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, it declared war on France. German troops prepared to enter Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan, a move that would soon bring Britain into the conflict. The speed of these events astonished observers. Only a month earlier, the world had been shocked by the assassination in Sarajevo, but few had imagined it would lead to a global war. Now, with armies mobilizing and ultimatums flying between capitals, Europe's fragile peace had collapsed. The First World War was no longer a possibility. It had become a reality. What began with a single act of violence in a Balkan city had triggered a chain reaction that engulfed nearly every major power on the continent. Once Germany declared war on France, the execution of the Schlieffen Plan moved into its final stage. This strategy had been created years earlier with the assumption that France would be Germany's first major opponent. The plan was based on the belief that France could be defeated quickly if Germany struck fast and in overwhelming force. Instead of marching directly across the French-German border, which was heavily fortified, German planners decided the army would move through Belgium. This route allowed the German troops to bypass strong French defenses and reach Paris from the north. However, Belgium was a neutral country protected by an international treaty that Germany itself had signed. Violating Belgian neutrality was not simply a military decision. It was a diplomatic gamble that risked drawing more nations into the war. Still, the German High Command believed that speed was essential and that victory depended on sticking to the established timetable. On August 2nd, Germany sent an ultimatum to Belgium demanding free passage for its troops. The Belgian government refused, insisting that its neutrality was non-negotiable. This refusal forced Germany to act. The next day, German forces crossed the Belgian border, encountering unexpectedly strong resistance. Belgian soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with determination. slowing the German advance. Civilians also played a role, spreading news and supporting defensive efforts. The world watched as reports of German atrocities in Belgian towns began to surface. These accounts, some accurate, others exaggerated, spread quickly across Europe and beyond, shaping public opinion and reinforcing the idea that Germany was willing to use extreme force to achieve its objectives. Britain had been watching the crisis with increasing concern. Although it was not formally bound to defend France in every circumstance, it was committed to upholding Belgian neutrality under the Treaty of London. The German invasion violated that agreement, forcing Britain to confront the possibility of war. Political leaders debated intensely, aware that entering the conflict would be a major step with far-reaching consequences. Some argued that Britain should stay out unless its direct interests were threatened. Others insisted that abandoning Belgium would undermine Britain's credibility as a protector of international law. Public opinion shifted rapidly once news of the invasion spread. The moral and strategic arguments aligned. On August 4th, Britain issued an ultimatum to Germany demanding withdrawal from Belgium. When no response came, Britain declared war. The conflict that began with a single gunshot in Sarajevo had now drawn in the world's most powerful empire. The war in Europe was no longer regional. It had become a global struggle shaped by politics, alliances, and the unforgiving momentum of mobilization. France had long anticipated the possibility of war with Germany. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 had cast a shadow over French politics for decades, creating a national desire for security and, for some, eventual revenge. Even so, French leaders approached the July crisis cautiously. They did not want to appear as aggressors and hoped that diplomacy might prevent Germany from taking drastic action. When Germany's ultimatum arrived demanding French neutrality, Paris understood that war was imminent. There was no possibility of abandoning the alliance with Russia, especially with German troops already mobilizing. France responded by preparing its own armed forces for conflict. Mobilization was announced, and reservists across the country received orders to report to their units. Streets filled with men leaving home, and families gathered in stations to say emotional farewells. Many believed the war would be short, ending in a decisive victory by Christmas. Few imagined a drawn-out struggle measured not in weeks, but in years. As German forces pushed through Belgium, France adjusted its defensive plans. The French army expected Germany to attack directly along the shared border, but the scale of the German movement through Belgium forced a rapid shift in strategy. French commanders soon realized that they would face a massive assault aimed at encircling Paris. The French government relocated from Paris to Bordeaux as a precaution, anticipating the possibility that the capital might fall. Yet even in this moment of danger, French morale remained surprisingly firm. Patriotism surged through the country, with citizens volunteering for service and contributing supplies. France saw itself as defending not only its territory, but also the values of independence and sovereignty threatened by German aggression. The early battles tested both sides brutally. French troops launched offensives along the eastern frontier, only to suffer heavy losses. Their traditional tactics, which relied on bright uniforms and aggressive charges, proved ill-suited to modern warfare with machine guns and heavy artillery. Despite these setbacks, the French army regrouped and began coordinating closely with British forces newly arrived on the continent. The Allies understood that stopping the German advance was essential to preventing a catastrophic defeat. The early weeks of fighting revealed the true nature of the conflict. It would not be a rapid, decisive war of maneuver. Instead, the battles showed signs of the grinding, attritional struggle that would come to define the years ahead. The sense of crisis that began with the assassination had now unfolded into full-scale war, reshaping the future of France and all of Europe. While Germany and France clashed in the West, Russia prepared to confront both Germany and Austria-Hungary in the East. Russian mobilization had already caused panic in Berlin, prompting Germany to declare war. Now, with the conflict officially underway, Russia faced the challenge of coordinating its vast but uneven military resources. The Russian Empire was enormous, stretching across thousands of miles, but its armies suffered from outdated equipment, poor infrastructure, and inconsistent leadership. Mobilization strained the country's railroad network, and many units faced shortages of rifles, ammunition, and even boots. Despite these difficulties, Russia moved quickly to engage the enemy. Its strategy aimed to relieve pressure on France by launching early offensives into East Prussia and Galicia. This decision was based on the principle of mutual support within the alliance system, demonstrating that the conflict was truly continental in scale. In East Prussia, Russia advanced with two armies, hoping to overwhelm German defenses before Germany could fully shift forces from the Western Front. At first, the Russian movement created alarm among German civilians and officials, who feared the symbolic and strategic consequences of losing Prussian territory. However, Germany responded with swift and decisive action. Under commanders such as Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, the German army executed brilliant counterattacks that led to the destruction of a large portion of the Russian forces. The Battle of Tannenberg in late August became one of the early defining moments of the war. It showcased Germany's ability to concentrate its forces rapidly, use superior communication systems, and exploit the weaknesses of Russian coordination. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or captured, delivering a heavy blow to morale. In the south, Russia achieved more success against Austria-Hungary. The empire's multi-ethnic army struggled with poor cohesion and low morale. Russian forces advanced deep into Galicia, capturing towns and pushing Austrian troops back. The victories created temporary confidence within the Russian government and signaled to its allies that Russia remained a crucial partner. Still, the early phase of the war made one truth clear: the conflict would not be decided quickly. Each major power faced its own strengths and vulnerabilities, and the war was expanding in multiple directions at once. The Eastern Front alone stretched hundreds of miles, with battles taking place across forests, marshes, and open plains. This vast landscape, combined with the political instability inside the Russian Empire, guaranteed that the struggle would be long and unpredictable. The war that had begun with the hope of protecting Serbia now engulfed entire empires, with millions of soldiers moving across Europe in a conflict unprecedented in scale. By the autumn of 1914, both the Allies and the Central Powers realized the early war plans were failing. Germany had hoped for a swift victory over France, but the French resistance at the Marne forced the German army to retreat and abandon the dream of a quick conquest. After this turning point, commanders on both sides searched desperately for a way to break the growing stalemate. They attempted flanking maneuvers, each army trying to outpace the other in a sweeping movement around northern France and Belgium. This period became known as the Race to the Sea, not because the armies rushed directly toward the coast, but because they kept shifting northward until they finally reached the English Channel. Everywhere they met, battles erupted, creating new lines of confrontation. Yet despite these efforts, no one gained a decisive advantage. The result was a continuous, unbroken front stretching hundreds of miles. Once both sides realized that flanking had failed, they began to dig defensive trenches. At first, trench systems were simple, shallow depressions offering basic cover. But as the fighting intensified, the trenches grew deeper, reinforced with wood, sandbags, and barbed wire. Over time, they expanded into elaborate networks with front lines, support trenches, communication corridors, shelter dugouts, and fortified positions. The geography and weather of northern France shaped the construction. Rain turned trenches into mud pits. In winter, freezing temperatures caused frostbite and sickness. Soldiers lived with the constant presence of rats, lice, contaminated water, and the ever-present smell of death. These conditions became iconic elements of the First World War and symbolized its grueling, unforgiving nature. Trench warfare was not something military commanders anticipated. Traditional strategies were built around mobility, cavalry charges, and decisive battles. None of these tactics worked against entrenched machine guns and modern artillery. Attacks that might have succeeded decades earlier now resulted in horrifying losses. Yet commanders continued trying massive assaults, believing that with enough force they could break through the enemy line. Instead, the war evolved into a struggle of attrition. Each side tried to wear the other down through constant bombardment and infantry assaults across no man's land. The space between trenches became a deadly wasteland filled with shell craters, broken equipment, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The early months of the Western Front revealed the true nature of the conflict. A long, grinding war without quick victories, shaped by industrial technology rather than heroic charges. The world was witnessing a new era of warfare, and no one had a clear idea of how or when it would end. Life for soldiers on the front lines became a mixture of constant danger and slow, numbing routine. The trenches were both home and battlefield, a place where men slept, ate, waited, and fought. Days could pass with little activity, followed by sudden bombardments that shook the earth with terrifying violence. Soldiers spent long hours repairing walls, draining water, reinforcing parapets, and checking weapons. They had to remain alert even during quieter periods as snipers, artillery, and surprise raids posed continuous threats. The fear of gas attacks added another layer of anxiety. Chemical weapons such as chlorine and mustard gas began appearing in 1915, forcing soldiers to carry heavy masks and stay alert for sudden clouds of deadly vapor drifting across the battlefield. The physical conditions were harsh beyond anything most soldiers had imagined. Waterlogged trenches bred disease. Foot infections became common, especially trench foot, which developed when boots stayed wet for days. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on leftover food and, tragically, on the remains of fallen soldiers. Lice infested clothing and spread illness, causing itching and sleepless nights. The smell of mud, unwashed bodies, rotting wood, and decomposing corpses created a constant atmosphere that soldiers could never fully escape. Letters home often hid the worst details, but diaries and post-war memoirs later revealed the overwhelming misery of trench life. Yet despite these hardships, soldiers formed strong bonds with each other. Shared suffering created a sense of brotherhood that helped them endure the unimaginable strain. Psychologically, the war left deep scars. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, from artillery, snipers, or sudden attacks. Many experienced what would later be recognized as shell shock, a condition marked by trembling, nightmares, anxiety, and emotional breakdown. At the time, military leaders often misunderstood these symptoms, believing they reflected weakness rather than trauma. Some soldiers faced disciplinary action for refusing to fight, even when their minds had reached a breaking point. Still, many men found ways to cope, writing letters, joking with friends, singing songs, or holding on to small comforts such as a warm drink or a moment of sunshine. These glimpses of humanity sustained them through long months of uncertainty. Life in the trenches showed how war reshapes not only the land, but also the human spirit, forcing ordinary people to endure extraordinary levels of hardship and resilience. While the Western Front settled into a stalemate, the Eastern Front offered more movement, but no less brutality. The vast distances of Eastern Europe made trench systems less continuous, allowing armies to maneuver more freely. Yet mobility did not guarantee victory. Russia's early successes against Austria-Hungary had encouraged hopes that the Eastern campaign might progress quickly. However, the defeat at Tannenberg and later at the Masurian Lakes exposed profound weaknesses in Russia's command structure. Communications were unreliable, supply lines overextended, and coordination between different units inconsistent. German forces, under more unified leadership, exploited these problems with devastating effect. The Russian army suffered enormous casualties, and morale began to crumble under the pressure of repeated offensives and shortages of essential equipment. In the south, Russia's campaign against Austria-Hungary remained mixed. While Russian forces captured significant territory in Galicia, their gains were difficult to maintain. Austria-Hungary, though weakened, received increasing support from Germany, which sent experienced officers and reinforcements to stabilize the front. The Central Powers coordinated their strategies more effectively than before, gradually pushing Russian forces back. Each advance and counterattack consumed thousands of lives. The landscape of Eastern Europe changed hands repeatedly, leaving towns destroyed and civilians displaced. The Eastern Front lacked the static grind of the trenches in France, but replaced that with sweeping operations that brought devastation across entire regions. By late 1914, it was clear that both sides had underestimated the war's scale. They had entered the conflict expecting a rapid conclusion. Instead, armies were locked in campaigns that stretched hundreds of miles and consumed staggering amounts of resources. The war disrupted economies, drained treasuries, and forced governments to expand their military and industrial production far beyond anything they had prepared for. Civilians faced shortages, rising prices, and increasing government control over daily life. The Eastern Front illustrated how modern warfare could overwhelm not just armies, but entire societies. As winter approached, both sides dug in, regrouped, and prepared for the next year of conflict. The war had evolved from a diplomatic crisis into a global catastrophe, and the promise of a quick resolution had vanished. Europe was entering a long, punishing struggle that would reshape borders, topple empires, and rewrite history. As 1914 progressed, Europe was no longer the only center of attention. The war began drawing in empires beyond the continent, reshaping alliances and expanding the conflict into a global event. One of the most consequential developments was the entry of the Ottoman Empire. Long known as the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire had been losing territory and influence for decades. By the time the First World War began, many European leaders assumed the empire was too weak to matter. Yet the Ottomans still controlled strategic lands, waterways, and resources that made them a valuable potential partner. Inside Constantinople, political leaders debated whether to join the conflict or remain neutral. Their final decision reshaped the war's geography and strategy in ways few expected. The Ottomans were influenced by several factors. Their ruling party, the Committee of Union and Progress, believed that aligning with Germany would provide protection against territorial ambitions from Russia and Britain. Germany, eager to open new fronts against the Allies, saw the Ottoman military as a useful tool, even if its capabilities were uncertain. One of the most decisive steps came when German warships, fleeing British pursuit, were allowed into the Ottoman-controlled Dardanelles. The Ottoman government incorporated the ships into its navy, an action that Britain and France viewed as openly hostile. Tensions escalated quickly, and in the autumn of 1914, the Ottomans launched naval attacks on Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war immediately, and soon Britain and France followed. The entry of the Ottoman Empire transformed the conflict from a European war into a genuinely global struggle. With the Ottoman Empire involved, new fronts opened across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. The empire controlled the Dardanelles, a narrow waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Control of this passage had major implications for trade and military coordination. The Allies worried that if they could not keep the Ottomans in check, the war would become even harder to manage. Meanwhile, the Ottoman leadership hoped to use the war to regain lost prestige, weaken Russian influence, and strengthen internal unity. Yet internal divisions, especially among ethnic and religious groups within the empire, complicated their war effort. The Ottoman decision to join the Central Powers was driven by ambition and fear, but it introduced new challenges that would eventually reshape not just the empire's fate, but the entire geopolitical map of the 20th century. The war was growing larger, more complex, and more unpredictable as its participants expanded. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the war opened a vast new theater in the Caucasus, a region defined by mountains, harsh winters, and deep historical tensions. Russia and the Ottomans had clashed for centuries over influence in this area, and the outbreak of the First World War reignited their rivalry. Ottoman leaders hoped that a decisive victory in the Caucasus would weaken Russia's position and inspire uprisings among Muslim populations under Russian rule. However, the empire's military was not well prepared for the extreme conditions. Poor equipment, outdated strategies, and a lack of coordination between units made early operations difficult. The disastrous Ottoman offensive at Sarikamish during the winter of 1914 to 1915 demonstrated how dangerous the region could be. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death before even reaching the battlefield. The defeat shattered hopes of a quick victory and exposed deep weaknesses within the Ottoman command structure. Further south, battles unfolded in Mesopotamia, a region vital for its oil resources and river routes. British forces, operating from India, advanced toward Basra to protect their interests in the Persian Gulf. Unlike the trench warfare in Europe, the Mesopotamian campaign involved long marches across deserts, supply shortages, and difficult river crossings. British troops initially achieved success, but their advance toward Baghdad stretched supply lines dangerously thin. The campaign culminated in the Siege of Kut in 1915 to 1916, where thousands of British and Indian soldiers were surrounded and eventually forced to surrender. This defeat was one of the worst in British military history and highlighted the challenges of fighting in unfamiliar terrain. The region's heat, disease, and water scarcity made every movement costly. In the Middle Eastern deserts, geography shaped strategy as much as politics did. The Ottomans depended on long railway lines to move troops, but sabotage and supply problems constantly disrupted their operations. Villages, tribes, and local populations were drawn into the conflict in complicated ways, sometimes supporting one side and sometimes resisting both. The war in the Middle East became a mixture of conventional battles and smaller guerrilla actions. Although this front received less attention than the battles in France or Russia, its consequences were enormous. It weakened the Ottoman Empire economically and militarily, destabilized long-standing regional structures, and set the stage for future political transformations. These battles were part of a much larger pattern. The war was expanding into regions that earlier European conflicts had barely touched. Soldiers from distant lands now found themselves fighting in environments that challenged every assumption of traditional military strategy. As the war widened, European empires drew heavily on their colonies for manpower, supplies, and strategic support. The conflict quickly spread to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, where colonial rivalries and global trade routes shaped new fronts. Germany, which had acquired overseas territories late compared to other European powers, found its distant colonies targeted by Allied forces early in the war. Britain, France, and Japan coordinated operations to seize German possessions in Africa and the Pacific. These campaigns were smaller in scale compared to the massive battles in Europe, but they had profound consequences. They disrupted local societies, shifted regional power dynamics, and involved thousands of colonial soldiers who had little connection to the European political disputes that caused the war. In Africa, fighting occurred in regions such as Cameroon, Togoland, and the German East Africa. The last of these became one of the most enduring campaigns of the entire war. German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a prolonged guerrilla resistance that tied down large numbers of British, Belgian, and Portuguese troops. His strategy relied on mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and support from African soldiers who served in both German and Allied units. The campaign drained resources from the Allies and demonstrated how the global nature of the conflict forced them to commit troops far beyond Europe. Meanwhile, African civilians suffered enormously as villages were destroyed, food supplies confiscated, and hundreds of thousands of people displaced. The war's impact on Africa created long-term political and social consequences that continued well after the fighting ended. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan seized German territories, such as Qingdao in China and several island groups across the Pacific. Japan's participation marked the rise of a new regional power asserting itself on the global stage. British dominions such as Australia, New Zealand, and Canada also contributed significantly, sending soldiers to Europe and capturing German territories in the Pacific. These nations viewed their involvement as both a duty to the British Empire and an opportunity to define their own national identities. The war accelerated political developments within these dominions, encouraging stronger independence movements in the decades that followed. By 1915, the First World War had become a conflict fought across oceans and continents. Millions of people from Asia, Africa, and the Pacific were now involved, either as soldiers or as civilians caught in the upheaval. The globalization of the war showed how interconnected the world had become and how a crisis beginning in a single European city could reshape societies far away. Each new front added complexity, resources, and burdens to the struggle. The war had expanded beyond the expectations of its leaders, turning into a prolonged confrontation that demanded increasing sacrifices. What began as a regional crisis was now rewriting the structure of international politics. By early 1915, the stalemate in France and Belgium was becoming a political and military burden for the Allies. Casualties were mounting, supplies were being drained, and the public expected progress. Leaders in London and Paris recognized that they needed a new strategy, one that could relieve pressure on the Western Front without relying solely on frontal assaults. Attention soon turned toward the Ottoman Empire, which controlled crucial waterways linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. The Dardanelles Strait was the key to this entire region. If the Allies could force the strait open, they would gain direct access to Russia, enabling greater coordination and supply shipments. At the same time, crippling the Ottoman Empire might encourage Balkan states to join the Allied side. The idea seemed ambitious, but to many, ambition was precisely what the war now required. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, became one of the strongest advocates for a naval assault on the Dardanelles. He believed the power of the British fleet would be enough to overwhelm Ottoman defenses and force a breakthrough. The plan called for warships to bombard Ottoman forts along the strait and then move through the narrow channel. Churchill hoped the Ottomans would collapse quickly, removing one enemy from the conflict and altering the strategic balance. His confidence, however, was based on assumptions rather than detailed intelligence. The quality of Ottoman defenses and the resilience of their troops were underestimated. Yet political leaders were eager for a dramatic success, and many believed the operation would succeed with minimal losses. As the operation gathered momentum, its goals expanded. What began as a naval initiative soon evolved into a combined naval and land campaign. The Allies planned to send troops to the Gallipoli Peninsula to seize high ground overlooking the strait. This would allow the Navy to move freely and secure the route to Constantinople. The idea of capturing the Ottoman capital seemed attractive to Allied strategists, who hoped such a victory would shake the Central Powers and boost morale at home. But the logistical challenges of landing troops on difficult terrain, combined with the lack of reliable maps and reconnaissance, created risks that were ignored or underestimated. By the spring of 1915, the Allies were preparing for one of the most ambitious operations of the war. The stage was set for a campaign that would be remembered not for triumph, but for tragedy and missed opportunities. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops began landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The operation involved British, French, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian units. Many of the soldiers had never seen combat before, and some viewed the mission as an adventure. But any illusions of an easy victory disappeared the moment their boats approached the shore. The terrain was far more challenging than planners in London had anticipated. Steep cliffs, narrow beaches, and dense undergrowth created natural barriers. Moreover, Ottoman forces commanded by officers such as Mustafa Kemal anticipated the landings and positioned troops in strong defensive lines. The Ottoman soldiers fought with determination, understanding that defending Gallipoli meant defending their homeland and the gateway to the capital. The landing at Anzac Cove, where Australian and New Zealand troops came ashore, quickly turned into a desperate struggle. Instead of the wide, flat beach they expected, the troops found themselves in a cramped, rugged landing zone surrounded by elevated ground. Ottoman rifles and machine guns opened fire immediately, pinning soldiers down and making movement nearly impossible. The Allies attempted to push inland, but their attacks were disorganized and met with fierce resistance. Casualties mounted within hours. On other sections of the peninsula, British and French landings faced similar challenges. The Allied troops displayed remarkable courage, but poor planning and unclear objectives left them at a disadvantage. Over the following weeks, the campaign deteriorated into a brutal stalemate. The Allies dug trenches along the coast, while the Ottomans held the heights above them. Supplies were difficult to move, water was scarce, and temperatures swung from intense heat to bitter cold. Disease spread rapidly, claiming thousands of lives. Allied commanders attempted several major offensives, including assaults at Suvla Bay and Krithia, but these efforts resulted in heavy losses with little progress. The Ottoman defenders, led by officers who understood the terrain intimately, repelled each attack. The morale of the Allied troops suffered as they realized that victory would require more than bravery. It demanded a strategy that simply did not exist. Gallipoli had become another grinding battlefield, echoing the frustrations of the Western Front, but with far worse environmental challenges. The campaign's early promise had faded into a grim reality. By late 1915, it had become clear to Allied commanders that the Gallipoli campaign could not achieve its objectives. The hope for breakthrough never materialized. The Navy failed to force the straits, and the Army failed to secure the heights of the peninsula. Every attempt to advance met with fierce Ottoman resistance. Meanwhile, casualties continued to rise. Thousands had died in direct combat, but even more suffered from disease, dehydration, and poor sanitation. The logistical problems became overwhelming. Supplies were mishandled, water was rationed, and medical services were strained to their limits. The harsh conditions demoralized troops, many of whom began to feel abandoned by distant leaders who did not understand the reality on the ground. Political support for the operation collapsed as reports of failure reached London and Paris. Churchill faced severe criticism and was forced to resign from the Admiralty. The campaign had been intended as a bold stroke that would shorten the war, but instead it became a symbol of miscalculation and unnecessary loss. By December, Allied leaders finally agreed to withdraw. The evacuation, surprisingly, was the most successful phase of the entire campaign. Carried out with extreme caution and careful deception tactics, it was completed without a single casualty. But the withdrawal made clear what many soldiers had known for months. Gallipoli had been a costly mistake. The impact of the failed campaign was felt around the world. For the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli became a moment of national pride, reinforcing the belief that they could resist powerful enemies. It also elevated Mustafa Kemal to national prominence, setting the stage for his later role in shaping modern Turkey. For the British Empire, the campaign bitterly affected relations with Australia and New Zealand. The bravery of the Anzac troops became part of their national identities, but so did the sense that their soldiers had been sacrificed due to poor planning. Gallipoli helped fuel movements toward greater independence in these nations. Strategically, the failure meant the Allies lost a chance to knock the Ottomans out of the war early. The conflict in the Middle East continued for years, draining resources and complicating global strategy. Gallipoli became one of the most debated operations of the First World War, remembered for its ambition, its human cost, and the lessons it offered about leadership, planning, and the unpredictability of modern warfare. As the First World War expanded and the battlefield casualties mounted, governments across Europe began to realize that this conflict required far more than traditional military mobilization. It demanded the complete involvement of entire societies. Economies, transportation networks, factories, food supplies, and labor forces had to be redirected toward wartime needs. This transformation gave rise to what historians call total war. Under this model, governments assumed unprecedented levels of control over daily life. Policies that once would have been unthinkable became common as leaders sought to coordinate national resources. Rationing, censorship, conscription, and industrial regulations reshaped everyday existence. Citizens no longer viewed the war as something happening far away. They felt its presence in every aspect of their routines. Industries that once produced consumer goods were retooled for military purposes. Car factories manufactured trucks and tanks. Textile mills produced uniforms and bandages, and chemical plants shifted to creating explosives and protective gear. Governments introduced labor controls that required workers to stay in essential industries or relocate to where they were most needed. In some countries, strikes were banned and labor disputes were handled by special wartime committees. Railroads were placed under military authority, ensuring that troop movements and supply shipments received priority. These measures caused shortages in civilian markets, forcing families to use ration books for everyday essentials such as bread, sugar, fuel, and meat. The constant presence of scarcity shaped social behavior and increased public frustration. Many people felt patriotic pride at supporting the war effort while also struggling with the emotional and economic burdens it created. Censorship became another defining feature of total war. Governments closely monitored newspapers, letters, and pamphlets to maintain morale and suppress dissent. Reports of heavy casualties, failed offensives, or political disagreements were often softened or omitted. People relied on official statements that presented a carefully controlled version of events. Even personal letters from soldiers were screened to prevent the spread of pessimism. Despite these restrictions, rumors circulated constantly, sometimes causing panic or resentment. The gap between official optimism and the grim reality faced by soldiers led many to question whether victory was worth the sacrifices demanded. Yet, governments believed that control over information was essential to keeping societies united and focused on the war. This environment reshaped the relationship between citizens and the state, accelerating political changes that continued long after the guns fell silent. One of the most significant social changes during the First World War was the dramatic shift in the role of women. As millions of men left to fight, the need for labor in factories, farms, hospitals, and transportation grew sharply. Women stepped forward to fill these gaps, entering professions that had long been considered exclusively male. They worked in munitions factories, producing the ammunition and weapons that supplied the front lines. They operated trams and buses, drove ambulances, repaired machinery, and maintained agricultural production in rural areas. These contributions were essential to keeping economies functioning and ensuring armies received the supplies they needed. Employers, who had once resisted hiring women, now depended on them. This transformation had deep cultural implications. Before the war, many societies expected women to remain within domestic roles. But the demands of total war forced a reevaluation of what women could accomplish. Newspapers published stories celebrating female workers as patriots doing their part for victory. Governments encouraged women to join the workforce through propaganda campaigns, posters, and civic messages. In some countries, special training programs were established to equip women with technical skills. The most visible symbol of women's wartime contribution came from the munitions factories, where women handled dangerous chemicals and heavy machinery. These workers, often called munitionettes, faced significant risks, including explosions, toxic exposure, and long hours. Their courage and dedication challenged long-standing stereotypes and laid groundwork for future calls for gender equality. Beyond industrial labor, women also served as nurses, caregivers, and aid workers. Organizations such as the Red Cross expanded rapidly, providing medical assistance to wounded soldiers and supporting military hospitals. Women traveled near the front lines, offering care under conditions of intense danger. Their service earned admiration from soldiers and commanders alike. The emotional toll of caring for thousands of injured men left lasting psychological effects on many nurses, but it also strengthened their demands for recognition. The war demonstrated that women could perform physically demanding, technically complex, and emotionally taxing work at the same level as men. After the war, many would argue that if women had proven themselves indispensable during the conflict, they deserved greater political rights, including the right to vote. While this progress did not happen instantly everywhere, the war marked a major turning point in the evolution of women's roles within society. As the war dragged on, controlling public opinion became as important as managing armies. Governments understood that prolonged conflict required sustained civilian support. To achieve this, They developed propaganda campaigns that shaped how people viewed the war, their enemies, and their responsibilities. Posters urged citizens to enlist, conserve food, buy war bonds, and support industrial output. Newspapers printed stories of heroism and victory, even when the truth was more complicated. Films and public speeches reinforced patriotic themes, often depicting the enemy as brutal or uncivilized to justify the sacrifices being made. Propaganda did not simply inform. It guided emotions, encouraging national unity and discouraging dissent. These campaigns had varied effects. Some people embraced the messages, feeling inspired to contribute. Communities organized donation drives, volunteer groups, and public ceremonies. Schools taught children to see the war as a noble struggle. Yet as casualties increased and prices rose, the public's willingness to accept official messages weakened. Across Europe, workers protested poor conditions and shortages. Families who lost multiple relatives began questioning the purpose of the conflict. Anti-war movements grew, often suppressed, but never fully silenced. The strain was felt differently across classes. Wealthier citizens were insulated from shortages, while poorer families faced hunger and unemployment. This inequality fueled resentment and made propaganda less effective. As morale declined, governments tightened control further. In some countries, speaking openly against the war could lead to arrest. Newspapers that questioned military strategy faced censorship or closure. Still, underground pamphlets and whispered conversations continued. People wanted truth, not government assurances. Soldiers returning from the front on leave brought home first-hand accounts that contradicted official optimism. Their stories of mud, death, and futility spread quickly, deepening public doubt. Keeping societies committed to the war effort became a constant challenge, requiring harsher policies and more persuasive messaging. Propaganda played a powerful role, but could not fully shield civilians from the realities of prolonged conflict. The fight for public morale became one of the defining battles on the home front, shaping political decisions, social tensions, and the eventual direction of the war. Germany entered the First World War with confidence in its industrial strength, military discipline, and centralized organization. Yet by 1915 and 1916, the German leadership realized the war was transforming into a prolonged struggle that demanded far more than battlefield victories. The country needed to sustain millions of soldiers at the front while maintaining civilian stability at home. This challenge required massive economic restructuring. Factories that had once produced commercial goods were retooled for weapons, artillery shells, chemicals, and machinery. The government introduced new regulations to control output, direct labor, and distribute resources. Industrialists, military planners, and government officials collaborated to meet production quotas. But even with Germany's strong industrial base, the demands of total war exceeded expectations. Resources grew scarce, workers were exhausted, and the pressure of sustaining a multi-front war pushed the economy to its limits. One of Germany's greatest challenges was the British naval blockade. The British Royal Navy used its control of the seas to restrict the flow of food, raw materials, and imported goods into Germany. The blockade tightened year after year, creating shortages that affected every level of society. Basic items such as grain, meat, dairy, and sugar became difficult to obtain. Families were forced to subsist on substitute foods, some of which offered little nutritional value. The famous turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 remains a stark example. Crops failed, livestock numbers fell, and millions of civilians survived primarily on animal feed turnips. Malnutrition spread, weakening health and increasing vulnerability to disease. Children suffered the most, as their developing bodies could not withstand prolonged dietary shortages. Morale within Germany faced immense pressure. Civilians initially supported the war enthusiastically, driven by patriotism and the belief that victory would be swift. But as conditions deteriorated, support became harder to maintain. Long queues outside bakeries, rising prices, and rationing created widespread frustration. Workers grew angry as factory conditions worsened and wages failed to keep pace with inflation. Strikes and protests increased despite government attempts to maintain order. At the same time, the military demanded more soldiers, forcing conscription of older men and younger boys. Families already struggling with shortages now watched their last able-bodied members sent to the front. The emotional burden deepened. Germany still possessed a powerful army, but its society was slowly being drained. Each passing year made it clear that the war was not only a military battle, but an economic and psychological one. The country was entering a phase where desperation would influence military decisions, including the controversial choice to intensify submarine warfare. Austria-Hungary faced even greater difficulties than Germany. The empire had entered the war already weakened by decades of internal division, economic imbalance, and political rivalries among its many ethnic groups. German Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Romanians, and others lived under the same imperial structure, but their loyalties varied widely. While some supported the empire's war aims, many felt disconnected from Vienna's decisions. The early military failures, especially against Russia, shook morale across the empire. Entire units composed of minority groups surrendered more easily or defected when given the chance, not out of cowardice, but because they felt little loyalty to the imperial system. Austria-Hungary's leaders found themselves fighting not only the enemy, but also the slow erosion of unity within their own ranks. Economically, the empire was far less prepared for total war than Germany. Industrial output lagged behind, transportation networks were outdated, and agricultural production varied drastically by region. As the war continued, these weaknesses grew more severe. Trains struggled to deliver food and supplies to the front. Cities experienced shortages similar to those in Germany, but with even fewer organized systems in place to manage distribution. Rural populations resisted government demands to turn over harvests, sometimes hiding food to protect their families. Inflation soared, wages fell behind, and black markets thrived. Politicians bickered over how to allocate resources among different regions. The Hungarian half of the empire often resisted sharing supplies with Austria, while Czech and Polish leaders pushed for more autonomy, seeing the war as an opportunity to renegotiate their political status. The multi-ethnic nature of Austria-Hungary also affected military cohesion. Soldiers spoke different languages and came from communities with diverging national aspirations. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and unity. Casualties were devastating. Austria-Hungary lost enormous numbers of troops in the early years of the war, forcing the government to conscript older men, inexperienced youths, and populations previously exempt from service. Many felt resentment that their lives were being spent on a war they did not fully support. Desperation led to harsher government measures, including stricter censorship, food controls, and policing. Yet none of these steps solved the empire's underlying problems. As the conflict dragged on, Austria-Hungary grew increasingly dependent on Germany for supplies, leadership, and military support. Instead of acting as an equal partner in the Central Powers, it became a burden that Germany had to carry. The empire's internal cracks widened, foreshadowing the political collapse that would erupt before the war ended. The Ottoman Empire entered the war hoping to restore its prestige, but the reality proved far more difficult. The empire faced enormous logistical challenges from the beginning. Its railroads were limited, its industrial base was underdeveloped, and its finances were already strained. Mobilizing large numbers of soldiers placed tremendous pressure on fragile supply systems. Food shortages were common, especially in regions affected by Allied blockades and internal disruption. In some provinces, famine conditions developed, leaving civilians desperate and angry. The government struggled to collect taxes, maintain order, and keep the army supplied. These burdens deepened as the war spread across multiple fronts. The Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Dardanelles all demanded troops, and the empire often lacked the resources to support operations effectively. Internal divisions made the situation even more precarious. The empire contained many ethnic and religious groups with differing degrees of loyalty to the central government. Arab populations in the Middle East were increasingly alienated by Ottoman policies, which they viewed as exploitative and dismissive of their autonomy. Tensions grew worse as Ottoman authorities attempted to tighten control over Arab regions, fearing that Britain might encourage revolts. In Anatolia, the government took harsh actions against Armenian communities, fueled by suspicion and paranoia following military setbacks in the Caucasus. These actions escalated into forced relocations and widespread violence. The consequences were devastating, causing immense suffering and long-term trauma. These internal conflicts weakened the empire politically and militarily, making it harder to wage an effective war. The Ottoman Empire entered the war hoping to restore its prestige, but the reality proved far more difficult. The empire faced enormous logistical challenges from the beginning. Its railroads were limited, its industrial base was underdeveloped, and its finances were already strained. Mobilizing large numbers of soldiers placed tremendous pressure on fragile supply systems. Food shortages were common, especially in regions affected by Allied blockades and internal disruption. In some provinces, famine conditions developed, leaving civilians desperate and angry. The government struggled to collect taxes, maintain order, and keep the army supplied. These burdens deepened as the war spread across multiple fronts. The Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Dardanelles all demanded troops, and the empire often lacked the resources to support operations effectively. Internal divisions made the situation even more precarious. The empire contained many ethnic and religious groups with differing degrees of loyalty to the central government. Arab populations in the Middle East were increasingly alienated by Ottoman policies, which they viewed as exploitative and dismissive of their autonomy. Tensions grew worse as Ottoman authorities attempted to tighten control over Arab regions, fearing that Britain might encourage revolts. In Anatolia, the government took harsh actions against Armenian communities, fueled by suspicion and paranoia following military setbacks in the Caucasus. These actions escalated into forced relocations and widespread violence. The consequences were devastating, causing immense suffering and long-term trauma. These internal conflicts weakened the empire politically and militarily, making it harder to wage an effective war. Despite these problems, Ottoman soldiers displayed remarkable resilience. Their defense of Gallipoli demonstrated skill and determination. In Mesopotamia and the Sinai, they fought under harsh conditions that would have broken many armies. But bravery alone could not compensate for structural weakness. The war drained the empire's population, economy, and morale. Cities struggled to provide basic services. and refugees moved across the region seeking safety. Disease spread rapidly due to poor sanitation and limited medical support. Many civilians felt abandoned by a government focused almost entirely on military survival. By 1916, discontent was growing, and the empire faced increasing pressure from both outside enemies and internal unrest. The long-term consequences of these hardships would reshape borders, identities, and political landscapes long after the war ended. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict hoping to revive its fortunes, but the war pushed it closer to dissolution instead. The Battle of Verdun, which began in February 1916, became one of the most iconic and devastating confrontations of the entire war. Germany initiated the offensive with a clear purpose: to bleed France to the point of collapse. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed that if he could force France into a massive, prolonged battle at a location the French considered sacred, their army would be compelled to defend it at any cost. Verdun held immense symbolic value in French history. It was a fortress city with roots stretching back centuries, a place that represented national identity and resilience. Falkenhayn assumed that France would commit everything to its defense, allowing Germany to wear down the French army through attrition. His strategy was cold and calculated. Rather than aiming for territorial gain, he sought to drain the enemy's manpower and morale. From a moment the German artillery opened fire, the scale of Verdun shocked the world. Thousands of shells rained down daily, reshaping the landscape into a barren wasteland of smoke, mud, and shattered trees. Villages vanished under bombardment. The fortress system, once considered impregnable, cracked under relentless pressure. French commanders scrambled to reinforce the area, understanding that losing Verdun would be a catastrophic blow both strategically and psychologically. General Philippe Pétain took command and introduced strict organizational measures, including the famous Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Road. This supply route brought a continuous flow of troops, weapons, and provisions into Verdun. The French rotated units regularly, ensuring that no division collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers understood that defending Verdun was a national obligation, and their determination became a powerful symbol of French unity. The fighting dragged on month after month. Entire hills changed hands repeatedly. Trenches filled with mud, blood, and debris. The air was thick with smoke from artillery bursts, making it difficult for soldiers to see more than a few meters ahead. Conditions were so severe that many men described Verdun as a living nightmare. Casualties skyrocketed, yet neither side retreated. German forces launched wave after wave of attacks, but French defenders held firm. Eventually, Germany realized its plan had failed. Instead of breaking France, Verdun had consumed vast numbers of German troops as well. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, nearly 1 million soldiers from both sides were dead or wounded. Verdun did not produce a decisive strategic victory, but it became a defining symbol of endurance. For France, Verdun proved that the nation could withstand unimaginable suffering. For Germany, the battle revealed the limits of attrition warfare. And for Europe, Verdun became a reminder of the staggering human cost of modern conflict, where thousands of lives could be spent to gain only a few yards of broken ground. While Verdun raged in the east, the Allies prepared a massive offensive along the River Somme. The operation was originally designed to relieve pressure on the French army and break the stalemate on the Western Front. When the Germans launched their attack on Verdun, British forces took on a greater share of responsibility, and the Somme became primarily a British-led campaign. Military planners envisioned a large-scale assault preceded by a prolonged artillery bombardment intended to destroy German defenses and cut barbed wire barriers. The Allies believed that once the German lines were softened, infantry troops could advance with minimal resistance. But this assumption proved disastrously wrong. The Germans had constructed deep, reinforced bunkers that allowed soldiers to survive even the heaviest shelling. Much of the wire remained intact, and many artillery shells were defective or failed to explode. On July 1st, 1916, British troops advanced across no man's land in long lines, expecting weakened resistance. Instead, German machine gunners emerged from their shelters and unleashed devastating fire. The result was one of the bloodiest days in British military history. Thousands fell within minutes. Entire units were wiped out before reaching enemy trenches. Yet the offensive continued, expanding across the front and growing into one of the largest battles of the war. The Somme illustrated how industrial-age weapons, machine guns, heavy artillery, rapid-fire rifles, and high explosives made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. Soldiers confronted a battlefield shaped by technology far beyond anything the previous century had imagined. The cost of learning these lessons was paid in human lives. As the months passed, the Allies made small gains but at staggering cost. Mud, rain, and constant shelling reduced the terrain to a vast field of craters and shattered earth. Tanks were introduced for the first time, offering promise but suffering from mechanical failures. Airplanes played a growing role in reconnaissance and combat, marking another shift toward modern warfare. Yet despite these technological innovations, progress remained painfully slow. By November, the battle ended with minimal territorial gains, far short of the decisive breakthrough the Allies had hoped for. More than 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded. The Somme became a symbol of the futility of large-scale assaults against entrenched positions. It demonstrated that victory would not come through one grand offensive, but through relentless, exhausting attrition. The battlefield embodied the war's transformation into a struggle measured not by movement, but by endurance. The Somme left deep scars on the armies and societies involved, reshaping military strategy and public opinion for years to come. While the Western Front was dominated by slow, grinding battles, the Eastern Front witnessed one of the most effective offensives of the entire war. In 1916, Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched a carefully planned attack against Austria-Hungary in Galicia. The operation surprised both allies and enemies. Russia had suffered serious setbacks earlier in the conflict, and many expected its forces to remain on the defensive. But Brusilov introduced new tactics that broke away from outdated strategies. Instead of concentrating forces at a single point, he organized simultaneous attacks along a broad front. He improved trench preparation, camouflage, and artillery coordination. Russian soldiers trained extensively for the assault, learning infiltration tactics that emphasized speed and surprise. These innovations allowed Russia to achieve results unmatched elsewhere in the war at that time. When the offensive began in June 1916, Austrian defenses collapsed rapidly. Entire divisions broke apart under Russian pressure. The multi-ethnic composition of the Austro-Hungarian army contributed to its fragility, as some troops surrendered or retreated without orders. The Russian advance captured large areas of territory and inflicted massive casualties, so devastating that Germany had to divert reinforcements from the Western Front to prevent a total collapse. Brusilov's success marked one of the few moments in the war when the Central Powers appeared genuinely vulnerable. It also demonstrated how effective leadership and innovative tactics could overcome structural weaknesses in Russia's military system. Yet the operation had limits. Russia lacked the logistical strength to sustain momentum. Supplies ran short, reinforcements were slow, and coordination with other Russian generals faltered. Although the Brusilov offensive ultimately lost momentum, its consequences were far-reaching. It weakened Austria-Hungary to the point that the empire never fully recovered. Germany grew more dominant within the Central Powers, deepening Austria-Hungary's dependence. The offensive also encouraged Romania to enter the war on the Allied side. While Romania itself soon faced invasion, its entry further stretched the Central Powers' resources. Inside Russia, the offensive temporarily boosted morale, but it also highlighted the extreme pressure placed on soldiers and civilians. The enormous casualties, combined with ongoing shortages and political turmoil, contributed to rising dissatisfaction at home. Brusilov's achievements stood as a rare example of tactical innovation during a war often defined by stagnation. The offensive showed what was possible when leadership, preparation, and strategic vision aligned. Yet it also revealed the limitations of an empire struggling with internal instability. Like so many events in the First World War, its success carried seeds of future crisis. By 1917, the Russian Empire was staggering under the weight of the war. Years of casualties, economic breakdown, food shortages, and political mismanagement had eroded public trust in the government. Soldiers at the front were exhausted, often poorly supplied, and increasingly unwilling to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. Civilians in cities such as Petrograd and Moscow faced long lines for bread, rising prices, and harsh winters without adequate fuel. The war magnified every existing weakness in Russia's political structure. Tsar Nicholas II, already facing criticism for his rigid leadership style, became increasingly isolated. His decision to take personal command of the army in 1915 removed him from political affairs at home and tied his reputation directly to military outcomes. Meanwhile, his government struggled with corruption, incompetence, and internal feuding. By early 1917, anger in the streets reached a breaking point. In February, women protesting bread shortages sparked demonstrations that quickly grew into mass strikes. Workers demanded reform. Soldiers refused orders to suppress crowds, and the Tsar found himself with no reliable support. Under pressure from military leaders and political figures, Nicholas II abdicated the throne in March. For the first time in centuries, Russia no longer had a monarchy. A provisional government took power, promising democratic reforms and a brighter future. But one of its first major decisions, to continue fighting in the war, proved disastrous. The Russian people wanted peace, not more sacrifice. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers, and political radicals gained influence. Among these radicals was the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin. Returning from exile, Lenin presented a simple, powerful message: peace, land, and bread. He called for an immediate end to the war, redistribution of land, and transfer of power to workers' councils, or Soviets. As the provisional government faltered, the Bolsheviks gained momentum. By autumn, Russia was in political chaos. The army was disintegrating, the economy was collapsing, and public frustration grew deeper by the day. In October 1917, Lenin and his followers launched a coordinated uprising, seizing control of key institutions in Petrograd. The provisional government collapsed with surprising ease. Russia now had a new revolutionary government committed to withdrawing from the war entirely. The collapse of the Eastern Front reshaped the entire conflict. Russia's departure freed Germany to shift troops west, giving the Central Powers a temporary advantage. Yet the revolution introduced long-term uncertainties that extended far beyond the war. Civil war soon erupted within Russia, and the country entered one of the most turbulent periods in its history. For Europe, the Russian Revolution signaled that even the oldest empires could crumble under the pressures of modern warfare. It also demonstrated that public dissatisfaction, when combined with military exhaustion, could reshape political systems on a massive scale. The events of 1917 marked a turning point not only for Russia, but for the entire world. When the First World War began, the United States declared neutrality. Most Americans viewed the conflict as a distant European problem. President Woodrow Wilson believed the nation could act as a mediator rather than a combatant. American businesses traded with both sides, though economic ties with the Allies gradually grew stronger. As the war progressed, however, staying neutral became increasingly difficult. German submarine warfare posed a serious threat to civilian and commercial vessels in the Atlantic. Germany believed unrestricted submarine attacks were essential to defeating Britain, whose naval blockade had severely weakened the Central Powers. But submarine warfare risked provoking the United States, which had repeatedly warned Germany against targeting neutral ships. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 100 American passengers, brought public outrage. Germany briefly restricted its submarine campaign, hoping to avoid American entry into the war. But by 1917, facing food shortages and dwindling supplies, German leaders decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They believed they could starve Britain into surrendering before the United States could mobilize. At the same time, British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany encouraging Mexico to join the Central Powers in exchange for help recovering lost territories, such as Texas and Arizona. When the United States learned of this proposal, public opinion shifted sharply. Many Americans who had previously favored neutrality now saw Germany as a threat, not just to Europe, but to their own national security. In April 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war. He framed the decision as a moral necessity, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States entered the war with a sense of purpose, but its military was still small and underprepared. Over the next year, America mobilized millions of men, expanded its navy, and built a large-scale domestic war industry. The arrival of fresh American troops in Europe boosted Allied morale at a time when exhaustion was widespread. Although the United States did not immediately transform the battlefield, its entry changed the strategic balance. Germany now faced a growing industrial power with vast resources and manpower. Even before American troops arrived in large numbers, the psychological effect on both sides was significant. Allies felt renewed hope. Germans felt the window for victory growing narrower. The United States had entered the conflict reluctantly, but its involvement would become decisive in shaping the war's final outcome. By 1917, the war had reached a level of exhaustion that pushed armies and societies toward breaking points. On the Western Front, soldiers endured years of shells, mud, hunger, and constant fear. Many had fought in battles such as Verdun and the Somme, only to see minimal gains at unimaginable cost. Hopes of a swift victory had long vanished. France, in particular, faced a crisis after a failed offensive led by General Robert Nivelle. Promised as a breakthrough that would end the war, the operation instead resulted in heavy losses with almost no gains. Soldiers felt betrayed, as if their suffering had been ignored by leaders who made reckless decisions. The disappointment quickly turned into open resistance. In April 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war. He framed the decision as a moral necessity, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. The United States entered the war with a sense of purpose, but its military was still small and underprepared. Over the next year, America mobilized millions of men, expanded its navy, and built a large-scale domestic war industry. The arrival of fresh American troops in Europe boosted Allied morale at a time when exhaustion was widespread. Although the United States did not immediately transform the battlefield, its entry changed the strategic balance. Germany now faced a growing industrial power with vast resources and manpower. Even before American troops arrived in large numbers, the psychological effect on both sides was significant. Allies felt renewed hope. Germans felt the window for victory growing narrower. The United States had entered the conflict reluctantly, but its involvement would become decisive in shaping the war's final outcome. By 1917, the war had reached a level of exhaustion that pushed armies and societies toward breaking points. On the Western Front, soldiers endured years of shells, mud, hunger, and constant fear. Many had fought in battles such as Verdun and the Somme, only to see minimal gains at unimaginable cost. Hopes of a swift victory had long vanished. France, in particular, faced a crisis after a failed offensive led by General Robert Nivelle. Promised as a breakthrough that would end the war, the operation instead resulted in heavy losses with almost no gains. Soldiers felt betrayed, as if their suffering had been ignored by leaders who made reckless decisions. The disappointment quickly turned into open resistance. French soldiers began refusing orders, not out of cowardice, but out of hopelessness. The mutiny spread quietly but widely across the army. Troops agreed to defend positions but refused to launch pointless attacks. They demanded better conditions, clearer goals, and relief from relentless pressure. The French government reacted carefully. Rather than launching mass punishments, they replaced Nivelle with General Pétain, who understood the psychological needs of exhausted troops. Pétain improved food supplies, increased rest periods, and avoided unnecessary offensives. While several soldiers faced court-martial, the army as a whole regained stability. But the mutiny showed that even strong nations could reach their limits under prolonged stress. Germany faced its own internal crises. Civilians endured starvation, political unrest, and deepening resentment toward the government. Workers went on strike, demanding bread and peace. Soldiers at the front saw their families suffering and questioned the purpose of continuing the fight. The promise of a decisive victory seemed more distant each month. As morale declined, desertions increased and discipline weakened. Austria-Hungary struggled even more, with ethnic tensions rising and military unity collapsing. The empire's internal divisions made every year of war more difficult to endure. Across Europe, 1917 became a year defined by frustration and fatigue. Armies still fought, but the enthusiasm of earlier years had vanished. Governments struggled to maintain public support. Propaganda lost its effectiveness. Leaders realized they could not rely solely on sacrifices or patriotic appeals. They needed hope, something that could convince soldiers and civilians that victory was still possible. For the Allies, that hope increasingly came from the United States and the expectation of fresh manpower. For the Central Powers, it came from the belief that Russia's collapse might give them a brief window to strike a decisive blow. As the year ended, both sides prepared for the next phase of the conflict, knowing that the war's outcome depended on whether they could endure just a little longer. With Russia's withdrawal from the war in late 1917, Germany gained the strategic opportunity it had been waiting for. The Eastern Front, which had consumed massive resources and manpower, effectively dissolved. German leaders hoped this would allow them to redirect troops westward and strike a decisive blow before the United States could deploy its full military strength. In early 1918, negotiations between the new Bolshevik government and the Central Powers culminated in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The treaty stripped Russia of enormous territories including Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Belarus. Germany gained access to agricultural land, raw materials, and strategic routes. In Berlin, the treaty was portrayed as a triumph that justified years of sacrifice on the Eastern Front. Yet the victory was more fragile than it appeared. Administering the newly acquired territories demanded significant manpower, and the populations living there were not necessarily supportive. Many resisted German occupation. Others faced internal struggles of their own, as Bolshevik forces clashed with opponents in the early stages of the Russian Civil War. Even as Germany gained land, it lacked the resources to fully exploit it in the short time available. The German population at home was suffering from malnutrition and shortages caused by the British blockade. Factories struggled to keep pace with demand. Unrest simmered among workers and soldiers who questioned whether continuing the war was worth the suffering. Still, military planners believed they had a closing window of opportunity. Tens of thousands of troops, no longer needed on the Eastern Front, were transported to France and Belgium. The hope was simple: break the Allied lines before American forces arrived in large numbers. German generals such as Erich Ludendorff believed that only an aggressive, all-or-nothing offensive could force the Allies into negotiations. The German High Command accepted the risks, knowing that failure would leave the empire exhausted and defenseless. The sense of urgency shaped every decision. Brest-Litovsk had given Germany temporary breathing room, but it also pushed leaders toward reckless action. They felt that history had offered one final chance to win a war that had already dragged on far longer than anyone expected. As the Western Front prepared for the next phase of the conflict, soldiers sensed a dramatic shift. German morale rose briefly with the hope of victory. Allied commanders, however, were well aware that a massive offensive was coming. The stage was set for some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. The collapse of Russia had changed the balance, but whether it would change the outcome remained uncertain. The treaty marked both Germany's greatest territorial gain and the beginning of its final gamble. In March 1918, Germany launched the Spring Offensive, a sweeping series of attacks designed to break the stalemate once and for all. The offensive was ambitious, fast-moving, and built on innovative tactics. Germany had developed specialized assault units known as stormtroopers. These troops were trained to move quickly, avoid fortified positions, infiltrate weaknesses, and disrupt enemy communication lines. Instead of advancing in large, tight formations, they operated in small groups, using speed and surprise to overpower defenders. This approach contrasted sharply with the slow, grinding assaults that had defined earlier years of the war. The goal was to collapse the Allied front before reinforcements from the United States arrived in strength. The offensive began with Operation Michael, a massive attack against British lines near the Somme. German artillery unleashed one of the largest bombardments of the war, followed by rapid infantry advances that caught the British off guard. Within days, German troops pushed deep into Allied territory. The speed of the advance revived German hopes that victory was finally within reach. British command struggled to stabilize the front, and some feared a complete breakthrough that could isolate British forces from the French army. Villages, trenches, and railways changed hands rapidly. The chaos forced the Allies to reorganize their command structure, appointing French General Ferdinand Foch as supreme Allied commander. This unified leadership helped ensure that the defensive lines did not collapse entirely. Despite early successes, the spring offensive faced critical limitations. Germany lacked the supplies needed to sustain rapid advances. Soldiers became exhausted, hungry, and stretched too thin across widening fronts. As they pushed into captured territory, they encountered problems that slowed momentum. Roads were damaged, artillery pieces lagged behind, and communication became difficult. The stormtrooper units, although highly effective at first, suffered heavy casualties that could not be replaced. Moreover, the offensive's objectives were unclear. Ludendorff launched multiple attacks in different regions, hoping that one of them would produce a decisive breakthrough. This scattershot approach diluted German strength. By summer, the offensive lost momentum. German forces had advanced further in 1918 than at any other time since the war began, but they had failed to achieve a strategic victory. Instead, they had exhausted their remaining reserves. The Allies, reinforced by fresh American troops and supported by strong supply lines, prepared for a counteroffensive. The German High Command realized that the window of opportunity had closed. The spring offensive had been bold, innovative, and initially successful, but also drained Germany's last operational reserves. It was a final gamble that did not deliver what its planners hoped. The tide of the war was beginning to turn. By August 1918, the situation on the Western Front had shifted dramatically. German forces were exhausted from the spring offensive and weakened by shortages, desertion, and declining morale. In contrast, Allied forces were growing stronger. The United States was sending more troops each month, and their presence boosted both manpower and morale. French and British units, shaken but not broken, had reorganized under unified command. With their lines stabilized and German strength waning, the Allies prepared to strike back. What followed became known as the 100 Days Offensive, a series of coordinated attacks that pushed the German army into continuous retreat and brought the war to its final stages. The counteroffensive began at Amiens in early August. Allied commanders combined infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft in ways that demonstrated how far modern warfare had evolved since 1914. Tanks broke through wire defenses, aircraft provided reconnaissance and support, and artillery fire was coordinated to suppress German positions. The assault shocked German defenders, many of whom surrendered rather than fight to the last man. German commanders later referred to August 8th as the Black Day of the German army, because morale collapsed so visibly among their ranks. From Amiens, the Allies pressed forward along multiple points of the front, exploiting German weaknesses and preventing them from regrouping. Over the next 3 months, the Allies liberated territory that had been occupied since the early years of the war. Each step forward placed additional pressure on German supply lines and communication networks. Meanwhile, conditions inside Germany deteriorated rapidly. Workers went on strike, sailors mutinied, and civilians faced starvation. The government struggled to maintain order as political unrest spread. Soldiers returning from the front described hopeless conditions, further undermining support for the war. The German High Command realized the situation was unsustainable. They requested that civilian leaders seek an armistice. As Allied troops advanced toward the German border, the Central Powers began to collapse. Bulgaria capitulated, the Ottoman Empire sought peace, and Austria-Hungary dissolved into separate national states. Germany found itself isolated and internally fractured. The 100 Days Offensive did not rely on a single decisive victory. Instead, it demonstrated continuous pressure, coordinated attacks, and the overwhelming advantage of fresh American troops combined with experienced Allied forces. By November 1918, Germany had no choice but to negotiate an end to the conflict. The collapse was sudden but inevitable. The war that had begun with confidence and ambition ended with exhaustion and desperation. The final offensive showed that even the strongest armies could fall when resources, morale, and unity disappeared. The end was approaching, and the world braced for what would come next. By late 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no longer a unified political entity, but a fragile structure held together by habit, fear, and the fading authority of the Habsburg monarchy. The cumulative strain of the war, its casualties, food shortages, military failures, and nationalist tensions, had pushed the empire to a breaking point. While Austria-Hungary began the war already weakened by internal division, the prolonged conflict intensified every fault line. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 had devastated its armies, and its continued dependence on German support made it clear to the world that the empire could not sustain the war on its own. Each additional year brought more desertions, more political tension, and more resentment among minority populations who felt they were being sacrificed for a war that did not reflect their interests or identity. As the military situation worsened in 1918, movements for independence grew stronger. Czech leaders pushed for complete political autonomy. South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes sought unification into a single state. Poles saw an opportunity to rebuild a homeland that had been divided for over a century. Romanians in Transylvania looked to join the Kingdom of Romania. These national aspirations were not new, but the chaos of the war allowed them to flourish. Instead of a centralized empire managing dissent, Austria-Hungary became a collection of increasingly assertive regions seeking self-determination. The government in Vienna had little ability to resist these demands. When the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, Austria-Hungary's army disintegrated rapidly. Units composed of minority groups refused orders or surrendered. Frontline troops were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Supply networks had nearly collapsed. With each defeat, political movements at home gained confidence. By October 1918, the empire no longer functioned as a unified state. Local councils declared independence in Prague, Zagreb, Ljubljana, and other cities. Emperor Karl attempted desperate reforms, offering a federal structure that would provide autonomy to the empire's nationalities. But the proposal came too late. Nations that had waited decades for freedom were not willing to negotiate limited concessions. The empire dissolved in a matter of weeks. Austria declared itself a republic. Hungary broke away under separate leadership, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, was born. Czechoslovakia emerged as an independent nation. Transylvania joined Romania. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled Central Europe for nearly 700 years, collapsed almost overnight. The dissolution was not peaceful everywhere. Ethnic disputes, territorial claims, and political rivalries created instability that would continue into the interwar years. But the empire itself was finished. The First World War did not simply defeat Austria-Hungary. It erased it from the map. The collapse reshaped Central Europe and set the stage for new national identities, alliances, and future conflicts. The Ottoman Empire entered the war hoping to regain influence, but by 1918 it faced overwhelming internal and external pressures. The empire had fought on multiple fronts for 4 years, stretching its already limited resources to the breaking point. From the Caucasus to Mesopotamia, from Gallipoli to Palestine, Ottoman troops faced superior enemy forces, harsh climates, and chronic shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Although Ottoman soldiers often fought with determination, their sacrifices could not compensate for inadequate infrastructure, weak leadership, and the empire's fragile political foundation. By 1917 and 1918, the empire was struggling to maintain basic governance. Regions such as the Arabian Peninsula grew increasingly autonomous or openly rebellious, encouraged by British support and promises of independence. The Arab Revolt, led by figures such as Sharif Hussein and guided militarily by British advisors like T.E. Lawrence, intensified the empire's internal fragmentation. Arab fighters captured key cities, disrupted Ottoman supply lines, and encouraged local populations to resist imperial authority. At the same time, British forces advanced through Palestine under General Edmund Allenby. The capture of Jerusalem in 1917 dealt a symbolic and strategic blow to the empire. Further defeats followed in 1918, including the decisive Battle of Megiddo, which shattered Ottoman defenses. With its armies collapsing and its internal cohesion fading, the empire could no longer sustain the war. Political turmoil erupted in Constantinople. The ruling triumvirate, the leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, found themselves blamed for military failures and economic disaster. Public resentment grew as famine, disease, and shortages devastated civilian life. The empire's transportation system barely functioned, making it difficult to move supplies even within remaining territories. Inflation soared, and living conditions deteriorated sharply. When Bulgaria surrendered in September 1918, the Ottoman Empire lost its last direct land connection to the Central Powers. Isolation made continued resistance impossible. In late October, Ottoman leaders sought an armistice with the Allies. The resulting agreement, the Armistice of Mudros, ended hostilities and permitted Allied occupation of key strategic zones. The end of the war did not bring stability. Instead, it opened a new chapter of geopolitical struggle. Occupation forces entered Constantinople, and rival nationalist movements emerged across Anatolia and the Middle East. Foreign powers sought influence over former Ottoman territories, while Turkish nationalists resisted attempts to divide the region. These tensions eventually gave rise to the Turkish War of Independence and the foundation of the modern Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Meanwhile, many Arab territories came under British or French control, setting the groundwork for political boundaries that remain influential and contested today. The Ottoman Empire's fall was not a single event, but a complex unraveling shaped by war, internal division, and the shifting dynamics of global power. The First World War marked the end of a centuries-old empire and the beginning of a new era in the Middle East. As 1918 progressed, Germany stood at the edge of disaster. The failure of the Spring Offensive had destroyed the last realistic hope of a military victory. The Allied counteroffensive pushed German forces back toward their own borders. Supply lines collapsed, soldiers deserted, and fatigue consumed the front lines. But the crisis on the battlefield was only part of a deeper national breakdown. Years of hardship, hunger, and political strain had pushed German society to its limit. The British naval blockade continued to starve the nation. Families struggled to survive on rationed food, and malnutrition spread rapidly. Factories suffered from shortages of raw materials, disrupting production. Workers launched strikes, demanding peace, bread, and political reform. The German High Command now acknowledged that the war could not be won. Ludendorff, who had driven many of Germany's strategic decisions, panicked and demanded immediate political changes. He hoped to shift responsibility for defeat onto civilian leaders, particularly democratic politicians who had previously criticized military policy. As the situation deteriorated, the government appealed to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson for an armistice based on his 14 points. But Wilson refused to negotiate while the Kaiser remained in power. This put Germany's monarchy at the center of a rapidly intensifying political struggle. The breaking point came in late October 1918, when the German Navy, in a final act of desperation, ordered a large fleet to sail against the British Royal Navy. Sailors saw the order as a suicide mission and refused to obey. The mutiny spread rapidly from Kiel to other ports, sparking nationwide uprisings. Workers and soldiers formed councils modeled after the Russian Soviets, demanding an immediate end to the war and the resignation of the Kaiser. Demonstrations erupted in major cities. Bavaria declared itself a republic. The once stable empire descended into revolutionary chaos almost overnight. Under mounting pressure, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9, 1918, fleeing to the Netherlands. A new Republican government was formed in Berlin, led by moderate Social Democrats who hoped to restore order and negotiate peace. The following day, Germany signed the armistice that ended fighting on the Western Front. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918. After 4 years of relentless warfare, Germany was defeated, its monarchy toppled, and its society left in turmoil. The collapse marked not only the end of the Kaiserreich, but the beginning of a politically unstable era that would shape the interwar period. The revolution, though swift, left deep divisions that Germany would struggle with for decades. The end of the war did not bring resolution. It opened the door to new challenges and conflicts that would define the 20th century. As the autumn of 1918 unfolded, the Central Powers faced a collapse that was immediate and unavoidable. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire had all reached the limits of endurance. Their armies were retreating on every front. Their economies were paralyzed, and their societies were erupting in strikes, demonstrations, and political revolts. Soldiers returned from the front, describing catastrophic conditions, and civilians starved under the pressure of blockades and shortages. Governments that had once demanded absolute loyalty now found themselves without authority. In this environment, the final weeks of the war were marked by a strange combination of frantic military activity and political disintegration. On the Western Front, German commanders struggled to slow the Allied advance, but the troops they relied upon were exhausted, malnourished, and increasingly unwilling to sacrifice their lives in a war that had clearly been lost. Mutinies, once rare, became alarmingly frequent. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot, not out of cowardice, but because they saw no purpose in continuing. Officers reported that morale could not be restored. Desertion rates soared. Soldiers who had survived years of trench warfare now found themselves overwhelmed by a sense of futility. Many knew their families were suffering at home, and their own hunger and fatigue mirrored the despair of the civilians they hoped to return to. As military lines collapsed, political authority in Germany unraveled at an even faster pace. Workers' councils formed spontaneously in major cities, inspired by the recent Russian Revolution. Local leaders demanded peace, democratic reform, and an end to the monarchy. The government in Berlin scrambled to maintain control, but each passing day weakened its legitimacy. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were collapsing even more quickly, declaring armistices and dissolving into separate national states. Germany tried to negotiate with President Wilson, but the United States insisted on new leadership as a condition for peace. When the German Navy mutinied at Kiel, the revolution became impossible to contain. The empire that had sparked the July crisis 4 years earlier was now crumbling from the inside. By the beginning of November, it was clear that Germany had no ability to continue the fight. The military command admitted defeat. Ludendorff fled. Civilian leaders took control, but they inherited a nation on the brink of collapse. When Kaiser Wilhelm II finally abdicated and fled into exile, the last major obstacle to peace disappeared. Germany's new government urgently sought an armistice to prevent further devastation. Soldiers, civilians, and political leaders all sensed the war's end approaching. Yet the suffering, uncertainty, and fear that filled the final days made victory feel distant and abstract. For the Allied armies advancing through muddy fields and ruined villages, the end brought relief mixed with disbelief. After 4 years of relentless combat, the moment felt surreal. The world waited for the guns to fall silent. During the first days of November, German representatives traveled to a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in northern France to meet with Allied commanders. The atmosphere was tense. Germany's delegates understood they were not negotiating. They were accepting harsh terms dictated by the victors. The Allied representatives, led by Marshal Ferdinand, offered no sympathy. For them, the suffering inflicted by years of war justified strict conditions. Germany was required to withdraw all forces from occupied territories, surrender thousands of artillery pieces, aircraft, and machine guns, repatriate prisoners, and maintain the naval blockade, even after the fighting stopped. These demands were severe, but designed to ensure Germany could not resume the war. The negotiations lasted several days, during which political upheaval in Germany intensified. A republic had been declared, and power shifted rapidly among competing factions. Yet despite the chaos, the German government knew the armistice was essential for national survival. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, at 5 a.m., Germany's representatives signed the armistice agreement. The terms established that fighting would stop 6 hours later, at 11 a.m. The decision passed quickly through commanders, messengers, and telegraph lines across the Western Front. Soldiers received the news with a mixture of disbelief, joy, and numbness. Some cheered, others wept. Many simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by exhaustion after years of unimaginable hardship. As the hour approached, fighting continued with deadly intensity. Artillery units fired shells until their last minute of authorized combat. Some commanders launched final assaults, hoping to gain ground before the ceasefire. For soldiers caught in these last-minute actions, the final hours of the war were as lethal as any that had come before. But when the clocks struck 11, the thunder of guns finally faded. Birds returned to skies that had been darkened by smoke for years. Soldiers emerged from trenches cautiously, aware that peace felt fragile and unfamiliar. Men who had fought each other for years now shook hands, traded cigarettes, and tried to comprehend the enormity of what had ended. In cities across Europe and North America, the news sparked massive celebrations. Bells rang, crowds flooded the streets, and nations rejoiced at the end of a war that had consumed millions of lives. Yet beneath the celebration lay a profound sense of uncertainty. The armistice had ended the fighting, but not the conflict's political consequences. The world had changed irrevocably. Empires had fallen. Borders would soon be redrawn. Millions of families grieved lost sons, husbands, and fathers. The legacy of the war would shape the peace negotiations to come and lay the groundwork for new tensions. November 11th marked the end of a nightmare, but the dawn that followed was clouded by questions about what kind of world would emerge from the ruins. For soldiers who had survived the war, the armistice brought a wave of emotions too complex to fit into celebrations or relief alone. Some felt pure joy at being alive, joy at the thought of going home, joy at the end of terror-filled nights and freezing trenches. Others felt an emptiness they could not explain. They had spent years in a world defined by danger, discipline and suffering. When the gunfire stopped, they found themselves lost between gratitude and shock. Many struggled to believe the silence was real. The constant threat of death had shaped their identities, and its sudden absence created an emotional void. Diaries, letters, and memoirs reveal how deeply the war had stamped itself onto the minds of those who lived it. Even on the day peace arrived, soldiers described hearing phantom artillery. Some kept ducking for cover out of instinct. The war had ended, but it refused to let go of their nerves. For civilians, the end of fighting meant the possibility of reunion with loved ones, but also the fear of discovering who would never return. Women who had labored in factories, hospitals, and farms now wondered what their futures would hold. Children who had grown up in scarcity and fear were too young to understand the significance of the armistice, but sensed the emotional shift in the adults around them. Many families had spent months without news from soldiers at the front. Even with peace declared, uncertainty continued until letters and official lists confirmed who had survived and who had not. In towns and villages across Europe, celebrations were followed by long periods of mourning. Communities gathered to honor the dead, build memorials, and support widows and orphans. The psychological scars of the war ran deep. Soldiers returning home carried memories of trench warfare, gas attacks, and the loss of friends. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, symptoms that modern understanding would identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, finding that the world they returned to no longer resembled the one they had left. Civilians also bore emotional trauma from years of fear, hunger, and loss. Nations attempted to rebuild physically and spiritually, but the wounds of the war were too extensive for quick recovery. Despite the pain, hope slowly emerged. People dreamed of a world where such destruction would never happen again. Leaders gathered to design a peace that could prevent future wars, though their ambitions would clash with political realities and national interests. The armistice brought an end to gunfire, but the world still faced the immense challenge of healing, rebuilding, and redefining its future. The final moments of the war were not just the closing of a chapter. They were the beginning of a new and uncertain era. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world did not transition smoothly into peace. Instead, nations faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding and redefining global relationships after 4 years of destruction. In January 1919, leaders from more than 30 countries gathered in Paris for what became known as the Paris Peace Conference. The meeting was unprecedented in scale. Diplomats, military advisors, economists, and political theorists filled the city, each carrying documents, proposals, and hopes for shaping a new world order. The conference represented a rare moment when the global community attempted to construct peace deliberately, rather than allowing it to unfold through force. Yet the diversity of interests and the magnitude of the war's consequences made agreement difficult. The dominant figures of the conference became known as the Big Four: President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each arrived with different priorities. Wilson championed a vision of peace grounded in moral principles and international cooperation. His 14 points, drafted a year earlier, outlined ideals such as self-determination, transparent diplomacy, and collective security. He hoped to prevent future conflicts by creating structures that encourage nations to resolve disputes peacefully. Clemenceau, however, had lived through German invasions of France twice in his lifetime. His priority was security and retribution. He demanded guarantees that Germany would never again threaten France. Lloyd George balanced the desire to maintain Britain's global influence with the need to rebuild the European economy. Orlando sought recognition of Italy's territorial claims, expecting rewards for Italy's sacrifices during the war. The broader world watched anxiously. Millions hoped the conference would end imperial domination, encourage national independence, or restore economic stability. Delegates from colonized regions, India, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa, appealed for self-determination, citing Wilson's principles. Yet these aspirations often clashed with the interests of the very countries controlling the conference. The Big Four monopolized decision-making power, and despite Wilson's idealism, the practical concerns of European leaders dominated discussions. The conference opened with optimism, but disagreements quickly surfaced. Peace would not be a simple agreement. It would be a contested process shaped by competing visions of justice, security, and national ambition. The world that emerged from Paris would carry the imprint of these complex negotiations. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was the most significant of the peace settlements produced by the conference. Although multiple treaties addressed various defeated powers, Versailles focused on Germany. From the outset, Germany expected the treaty to be harsh, but the severity still shocked many of its delegates. Clemenceau and others insisted that Germany bear responsibility for the war and its immense destruction. Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause, assigned full blame to Germany and its allies. This clause became the foundation for demanding reparations, financial payments intended to compensate the Allies for their losses. Germany viewed the clause as humiliating and unjust, but the Allied leaders argued that someone had to be held accountable for the unprecedented devastation. The treaty also imposed strict military limitations on Germany. Its army was restricted to 100,000 troops, conscription was banned, and the production of tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery was prohibited. The Navy was reduced to a small defensive fleet, and Germany was forbidden from possessing submarines. The Rhineland, a strategic region bordering France, was demilitarized to create a buffer zone. These measures were designed to weaken Germany's ability to wage war, ensuring long-term security for France and Belgium. Yet critics argued that such constraints would provoke resentment rather than stability. Germany saw these terms as a deliberate attempt to diminish its sovereignty and national pride. Territorial changes added further tension. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, regained by the French after nearly 5 decades of longing. The treaty redrew borders in Eastern Europe, creating new states such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. German-speaking populations suddenly found themselves living outside Germany's borders, fueling grievances that would echo for decades. Danzig became a free city under international control, and Germany's overseas colonies were redistributed among the Allied powers under the new mandate system, although the terms suggested oversight and guidance. Many saw it as a continuation of imperialism under another name. Wilson's vision of the League of Nations did make its way into the treaty. He hoped the League would provide a forum for international cooperation, limit the use of force, and prevent future conflicts. However, the optimism of this idea was undercut by the realities of the treaty itself. While the League represented a new hope for diplomacy, the punitive aspects of Versailles planted seeds of anger and instability. Germany's economy suffered under the weight of reparations, and its political landscape fractured as factions fought over how to respond. The treaty achieved peace, but not reconciliation. Its contradictions would haunt Europe long after the ink dried. The peace settlements reached in Paris sparked immediate, worldwide reactions ranging from relief to outrage. For many Allied nations, the treaties represented justice. Citizens who had lost loved ones in the war wanted reassurance that their sacrifices had meaning. France, devastated by years of fighting on its own soil, felt vindicated by the treaty's harsh terms. Britain viewed the agreement as a means of maintaining balance in Europe while protecting its empire. Italy, however, felt betrayed. Orlando left the conference early after failing to secure many of the territories Italy believed it had been promised. This sense of disappointment would feed nationalist movements within Italy and contribute to future political instability. In Germany, the reaction was explosive. Newspapers denounced the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace forced upon a defeated nation. Political leaders argued that the war guilt clause misrepresented the complex origins of the conflict. Many Germans believed they had not been defeated militarily, but overwhelmed by economic hardship and political turmoil. The treaty's terms fueled resentment across the political spectrum. Moderate leaders feared the reparations burden would cripple economic recovery, while extremists exploited public anger to build support. The treaty did not immediately cause collapse, but contributed to the fragile foundation on which the Weimar Republic would struggle to stand. Elsewhere, the peace conference failed to meet the expectations of many who hoped the post-war world would embrace self-determination. Leaders from colonized regions realized that Wilson's ideals applied unevenly. Asian and African delegates, including influential figures like Ho Chi Minh, were ignored or dismissed. Their petitions for independence were sidelined by the priorities of imperial powers. In the Middle East, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire led not to independence, but to the imposition of British and French mandates. New borders were drawn with little regard for the cultural and political realities of the region, setting the stage for long-term instability. Despite these failures, the world also saw moments of genuine optimism. The establishment of the League of Nations offered a new approach to international diplomacy. Small nations hoped its structure would protect them from aggression. Humanitarian organizations flourished as part of reconstruction efforts. Economists and social thinkers envisioned new models for global cooperation. Yet the contradictions built into the peace settlements made the future uncertain. The treaties ended the fighting, but did not resolve the deep-rooted tensions that had fueled the war in the first place. The task of building a lasting peace remained unfinished, and the world would soon learn that unresolved grievances can be as dangerous as open conflict. The First World War inflicted a level of human suffering that shocked the world and reshaped societies for generations. By the time the armistice was signed, more than 9 million soldiers had died, and millions more were wounded. Civilian casualties were enormous as well, caused by famine, disease, forced displacement, and military bombardment. Entire towns and regions were destroyed. For families across Europe, the war left permanent gaps. Sons who never returned, fathers lost in muddy fields, brothers buried in mass graves. Every nation involved in the conflict carried scars, both physical and emotional. Cemeteries, memorials, and monuments sprung up across landscapes that had been battlefields, marking the immense scale of loss. The psychological impact was equally profound. Soldiers who survived often returned home fundamentally changed. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, a term that only partially captured the trauma of trench warfare, constant artillery fire, and the relentless fear of sudden death. Symptoms ranged from nightmares and anxiety to paralysis and emotional numbness. At the time, psychological injuries were poorly understood, and many veterans received little support. Some struggled to reintegrate into society, unable to explain their experiences to family members who had not witnessed the horrors of the front. Others found solace only among fellow soldiers who shared similar memories. The war created a lost generation of young men whose early adulthood had been consumed by violence, uncertainty, and trauma. Beyond the front lines, civilians experienced their own suffering. In Belgium, northern France, Poland, Serbia, and parts of the Ottoman Empire, entire communities endured occupation, forced labor, or destruction of homes and infrastructure. Food shortages led to widespread malnutrition, especially among children. Refugees moved across borders seeking safety, only to find new hardships in overcrowded camps or unfamiliar cities. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 further increased the toll. Spread in part by troop movements and weakened immune systems, the flu killed tens of millions worldwide, more than the war itself. The global population faced collective trauma unlike anything seen before. The human cost extended beyond loss of life and physical injury. It disrupted families, destabilized societies, and altered cultural values. Artists, writers, and intellectuals struggled to make sense of the catastrophe. The optimism of the pre-war era faded, replaced by cynicism, disillusionment, and a sense of fragility. Literature from the post-war period reflected this shift, with works highlighting the futility of war, the tragedy of lost youth, and the emptiness of nationalist rhetoric. The human cost of the First World War was not measured solely in numbers. It was measured in broken lives, shattered dreams, and emotional wounds that would take decades to heal. Economically, the First World War caused shocks that rippled across continents. European economies, which had once been strong and outward-looking, were severely weakened by the strain of years of total war. Factories that had focused on producing weapons and military supplies needed to transition back to civilian production, a process that proved far more complicated than many expected. Millions of soldiers returned home seeking employment, but jobs were scarce. In countries like Germany, Austria, and Russia, inflation spiraled out of control. Governments had borrowed enormous sums to finance the war, and post-war obligations, such as reparations or reconstruction, strained national budgets further. The financial instability pushed many nations into cycles of debt, unemployment, and political unrest. Infrastructure across Europe required massive rebuilding. Bridges, railroads, ports, and factories had been destroyed. Agricultural lands were scarred by trenches, shell craters, and chemical contamination. Farmers struggled to restore soil fertility. Livestock had been slaughtered or seized by armies. Food production lagged behind population needs, contributing to hunger and weakening economic recovery. Nations such as France and Belgium, where major battles had unfolded, faced decades of reconstruction. In contrast, the United States emerged from a war with a strengthened economy. American factories had supplied both sides during the conflict, and wartime production boosted industrial growth. After the war, the U.S. became a leading global creditor, replacing European nations that once dominated world finance. This shift marked a significant realignment of global economic power. The labor landscape also changed dramatically. During the war, women had stepped into roles previously dominated by men. After the armistice, many faced pressure to leave their jobs as returning soldiers sought employment. This transition created tension, but also planted the seeds for long-term changes in gender expectations, labor rights, and political activism. Workers across Europe demanded better conditions, higher wages, and recognition of unions. Strikes and protests increased, challenging governments to respond to shifting social and economic realities. Global trade networks were disrupted as well. Colonial economies, tied closely to European markets, faced instability. Countries that had depended on European imports or exports experienced shortages and surpluses that destabilized local industries. The mandate system imposed by the League of Nations altered control over key resources and trade routes, influencing economic patterns across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Some regions saw opportunities in the shifting global order, while others found themselves subject to new forms of dependence. Ultimately, the economic devastation of the First World War laid the groundwork for future crises. The instability of the 1920s, boom in some countries, collapse in others, followed naturally from the war's disruptions. The Great Depression of 1929, which would plunge the world into deeper turmoil, was shaped by unresolved financial imbalances that originated in the war years. The global economy entered a period of uncertainty that would influence politics, diplomacy, and social structure for decades to come. The political landscape after the First World War looked dramatically different from the world that existed before 1914. The collapse of empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, created a vacuum that was filled by new states, new political movements, and new ideologies. In Central and Eastern Europe, countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia emerged from the ruins of old imperial structures. These new states had to build governments, establish borders, and integrate diverse populations. Many faced immediate challenges, including ethnic conflicts, economic hardship, and tension between democratic aspirations and authoritarian tendencies. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution triggered a civil war between communist forces and their opponents. This struggle lasted years and caused tremendous suffering. The victory of the Bolsheviks led to the formation of the Soviet Union, a new political system that rejected capitalism, monarchy, and liberal democracy. The global ideological divide that would shape the 20th century began here in the aftermath of the First World War. Other nations also experienced political upheaval. In Germany, the Weimar Republic was founded amid economic crisis and social unrest. Although democratic in structure, it struggled to gain legitimacy as extremist movements on both the left and the right gained strength. This instability created fertile ground for political radicalization. Within a decade, extremist groups would become major political forces. In Italy, dissatisfaction with the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference and post-war economic difficulties fueled nationalist anger. Many Italians believed their country had been disrespected by the Allies and denied promised territorial gains. This frustration contributed to the rise of Benito Mussolini and the emergence of fascism, an ideology that promised national strength, unity, and revival, but rejected democratic governance. Similar movements appeared elsewhere, revealing how widespread disappointment and instability were across the post-war world. Outside Europe, political shifts also took shape. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire left territories under British and French control. Local leaders hoped for independence, but were instead confronted with new colonial arrangements. These decisions contributed to long-term tensions that continue to shape the region today. In Asia, the war encouraged nationalist movements in India, China, and Korea. The principle of self-determination inspired activists to question foreign rule and demand political rights. Many who witnessed the hypocrisy of Western nations, who preached freedom while maintaining empires, became more determined to pursue independence. The First World War did not simply redraw borders. It reshaped political thought. Old certainties died alongside fallen soldiers. The belief in endless European progress was shattered. New ideologies, communism, fascism, anti-colonial nationalism, rose in response to the failures of old systems. The war's political legacy was not stability, but transformation. It set in motion forces that would define global politics for the rest of the century and ultimately lead to the outbreak of another, even more destructive conflict only 2 decades later. The First World War altered not only borders and governments, but the very way people understood the world. Before 1914, Europe viewed itself as the center of global progress. Science, industry, and culture had advanced rapidly, and many believe humanity was entering a golden age. The war shattered this confidence. After years of trench warfare, mass death, and destruction, the public no longer saw war as a noble pursuit or national glory. Instead, the conflict exposed how vulnerable societies were to political miscalculation and military escalation. The cultural transformation that followed was profound. Writers, painters, and thinkers attempted to process the trauma, creating works that revealed disillusionment, cynicism, and a sense of lost innocence. Literature became one of the clearest reflections of the post-war mood. Authors such as Erich Maria Remarque, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen described the brutal realities of trench warfare. Their works stripped away romantic illusions and highlighted the emptiness of slogans that once inspired patriotism. Owen's poems, often written from hospital beds, exposed a generation's psychological wounds. Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front captured the hopelessness many veterans felt when they returned to civilian life. These works reached readers far beyond Europe, reshaping global conversations about conflict and its costs. The war inspired modernist movements in art and literature as creators abandoned traditional forms in search of ways to express chaos, fragmentation, and uncertainty. Public memory of the war also evolved in symbolic ways. Memorials across Europe honored fallen soldiers, yet the tone differed from earlier monuments that celebrated victory. These new memorials conveyed solemn reflection. Films, paintings, and newspaper editorials portrayed the war as a reminder of human fragility rather than triumph. Ceremonies on Armistice Day became occasions for both mourning and contemplation. Communities gathered to remember those who never returned and acknowledge the lasting effects of the conflict. Even in countries that emerged victorious, celebrations were overshadowed by grief. Almost every family had been touched by loss. The war also reshaped global attitudes toward authority. Many people questioned the competence of political leaders who had allowed a regional conflict to escalate into a global catastrophe. This skepticism influenced democratic movements, revolutionary groups, and demands for expanded political rights. Youth who came of age after the war were determined not to repeat their parents' mistakes. Yet this shift produced contradictions. While some pursued peace and diplomacy, others embraced radical ideologies promising strength and certainty. The cultural legacy of the First World War was not a single narrative. It was a mosaic of grief, disillusionment, resentment, and hope for renewal. It reshaped the 20th century not only through political change, but through the ways people interpreted human experience itself. With the war's end, leaders hoped to create an international system that would prevent another catastrophe. The League of Nations, championed by President Woodrow Wilson, emerged as the centerpiece of this effort. Its purpose was to resolve disputes through negotiation, establish collective security, and limit the spread of aggression. The League represented a groundbreaking idea in global diplomacy. Never before had nations agreed to a permanent organization dedicated to peace. Yet from the beginning, structural weaknesses undermined its effectiveness. The United States, ironically, never joined due to opposition in Congress. Without American power and influence, the League lost credibility. Furthermore, the League had no military force to enforce its decisions. It relied on member nations to uphold sanctions or take action collectively, but such unity proved difficult to achieve. Nations that were exhausted and financially strained after the war were reluctant to engage in military commitments for faraway conflicts. When crises arose, such as Japanese expansion in Manchuria, Italian aggression in Ethiopia, or border tensions in Eastern Europe, the League's condemnations carried little practical weight. These failures weakened trust in international cooperation just as the world needed it most. The peace settlements themselves added to the instability. The Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy burdens on Germany. While the authors hoped these measures would ensure security, they also created long-term resentment and economic hardship. German leaders struggled to meet reparation payments, leading to hyperinflation, unemployment, and political extremism. Many Germans believed the treaty was intentionally punitive and unjust. This anger became a powerful tool for radical groups that claimed they could restore national pride. Meanwhile, the new states formed in Central and Eastern Europe faced immediate challenges. Many included diverse ethnic populations with competing political aspirations. Borders drawn at the conference often ignored cultural and historical realities, leaving minorities dissatisfied and resentful. Governments struggled to maintain stability, and nationalist tensions simmered. Economic dependency on larger powers made it difficult for these states to navigate the complicated interwar environment. In the colonial world, the peace settlements produced a wave of political awakening. Leaders in India, Egypt, Korea, Vietnam, and other regions saw that Western powers spoke of self-determination while refusing to apply it fairly. This contradiction fueled anti-colonial movements. Activists demanded independence, and protests intensified throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The seeds of decolonization were planted in the aftermath of the First World War, even though independence would take decades to achieve. Ultimately, the interwar system was built on hopes that outpaced political realities. The desire for peace was strong, but the structures needed to protect it were fragile. The world entered a turbulent period shaped by economic crises, political radicalization, and unresolved grievances. The inability to secure a stable peace revealed that the First World War had ended militarily, but not psychologically. Its aftershocks continued to shape global politics, setting the stage for another conflict. The First World War is often remembered as the conflict that ended the Old World. The war destroyed empires, redrew borders, and challenged assumptions that had guided Europe for centuries. It marked the end of aristocratic dominance and the beginning of mass politics. It accelerated technological innovation, from tanks and aircraft to communications and medicine. It reshaped gender roles, labor rights, and international power structures. Yet its most enduring legacy may be the way it forced humanity to confront the consequences of industrialized warfare. The combination of mass mobilization, advanced weaponry, and rigid military planning produced destruction on a scale never seen before. The gap between political goals and human cost became painfully clear. The war also laid the groundwork for future conflicts. Many issues that emerged after 1918 remained unresolved, including territorial disputes, nationalist movements, economic instability, and ideological rivalry. The failure to integrate Germany into a stable international order, the rise of extremist movements, and the weaknesses of the League of Nations eventually contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War. Historians often describe the period between the two wars as an extended continuation of unresolved tensions from 1914 to 1918. The First World War did not simply end. It transformed into a new chapter of global volatility. At the same time, the war inspired movements dedicated to preventing such devastation from happening again. Veterans became advocates for peace. Artists challenged militarism. Diplomats pursued new frameworks for cooperation. The Geneva Conventions expanded. International humanitarian efforts grew. Although many of these efforts failed to prevent another war, they shaped the long-term development of global norms, human rights, and institutions that later became essential after 1945. The tragedy of the First World War pushed the world to rethink morality, governance, and the responsibilities of nations toward one another. Today, the war remains a symbol of human resilience and vulnerability. Its memorials stand as reminders of the consequences of unchecked ambition and political miscalculation. Its literature and art preserve the emotional truth of those who lived through it. Its lessons continue to influence diplomacy, military strategy, and public consciousness. The First World War was not merely a historical event. It was a turning point that reshaped the trajectory of the modern world. Its legacy lives on in the institutions we build, the conflicts we seek to prevent, and the questions we continue to ask about power, justice, and peace. You just traveled through one of the most important chapters in human history. From the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand to the collapse of powerful empires, from brutal battles like Verdun and the Somme to the birth of new nations, we explored how the world stumbled into a conflict unlike anything seen before. Today, we learned how political ambition, fear, and miscalculation created a perfect storm. How soldiers from every corner of the world endured unimaginable hardship. How societies changed as women entered new roles and global economies shifted. How revolutions, peace treaties, and broken promises shaped the century ahead. And how the legacy of World War I continues to influence modern politics, borders, and global relationships. The moral of this story is not just about war. It's about human choices. How quickly a small crisis can explode when leaders stop listening. How fragile peace can be. And how deeply ordinary people pay the price when diplomacy fails. If you enjoyed this journey and want more stories that bring history to life, make sure to come back to History Teller YT. There are many more voices, moments, and lessons waiting to be shared. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again in the next episode. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the past. It has more to teach us than we realize.